We can start life with one set of DNA in one cell and become trillions of cells with the same DNA. And despite all the complexities of the biological system, the environment's life course, they still have an effect later in life. But it's certainly not 100%, but you could say, isn't it amazing it's 1%? I mean, not only do we show everything's heritable when when I was in graduate school, thought nothing was heritable in psychology. Now people accept everything's heritable, not just a little bit. We're talking about amounts, 50% of the variance on average, which is just off the scale. And now, and I never thought this would happen in my lifetime, we're able to find some of the genes that predict some of that genetic variance. And these polygenic score predictors predict not just from birth, but prenatally, because your DNA doesn't change. Medicine's moving from cure to prediction, and DNA is the best early warning system we have.
Dr. Robert Plomin is the godfather of behavioural genetics, the man who rewrote the rulebook on what makes us who we are. While the world debated nature versus nurture, Plomin spent 50 years studying twins, and he found that nearly everything psychological is heritable, from intelligence and personality to mental illness and addiction. The environment still matters, just not in the way we thought. In this episode, we dive into my own genetics test results, what my rare mutation means for me. We talk embryo gene testing and selection, and explore the unsettling future of gene editing and designer babies. Subscribe if you want to know why Elon Musk might already be designing his babies, and why your genome might know your deepest secrets before your therapist does.
There's a lot of people who are worried about designer babies. We've talked about it for a long time. I don't know if you heard about this company that Elon Musk used, his latest girlfriend.
No.
It's called Orchid, Orchid, and their sort of byline, it's total Gattaca. The byline is, sex is for fun, embryo testing is for babies.
Wow.
So they're really going all out on this.
Right.
I think in the US, this is going to go wild. Are you a carrier for anything important?
Yes, let's go into that. So Dr. Robert Plomin, welcome back. I'm incredibly excited for this. Since our last conversation, there was some big news in the genetic space. A company called Nucleus Genomics, who we both spoke to their CEO. My genetics results my episode with him, with the CEO, will be live, where we go through my genetics results live for the very first time. They released a product called Nucleus Embryo. And this got a lot of news. It got a lot of feedback, both positive and negative. I've been asking lots of people in my life what they think about it, but I'm really curious what your thoughts are.
Right. Well, that's a big topic. And full disclosure, I'm a scientific advisor to Nucleus Genomics. And I got involved with them because their scientific director, you talked to Kian, how do you pronounce his name?
Sadeghi, yeah.
Sadeghi, who's the CEO, I guess, or the director. But the scientific director is this guy, Lasse Fulkerson, who's I think I mentioned him in our previous interview. He was a Finn who provided a wonderful academic service for creating these polygenic scores we talked about last time.
Yes.
Which I said last time, lots of companies say they're providing them, but they don't do a good job. And so he was doing that and was really cool about it. He deleted the DNA information that you sent him, and he just was a good soul to doing it. But turns out it's a very tricky space. It's litigious. And so he decided he couldn't do it as an academic. So he joined this company, Nucleus, as the scientific director. And he's the best in terms of providing scores that are interpretable, and they're good scores. It just kills me that these companies are providing polygenic scores that are almost worthless.
Right.
And for the same amount of effort, they could give you a good polygenic score. But it's Wild West, as I said last time, no regulation. They ought to have kite marks, at least showing, like, for height and weight, you can get polygenic scores that predict in your sample. So there's none of that. So because of that, I was kind of in at the building of this company, and advise them a bit, and I'm not paid by them, I'd like to emphasize, but I think we need something like that. We need someone to set the standards here. But um, I also was keen on this idea of carrier testing, as we mentioned last time. I
Yes.
think that's the most immediate impact. Like you mentioned in Ireland, almost 5% of the people are carriers for cystic fibrosis. We said last time that's a recessive gene, which means you need 2 copies to show it. You don't get cystic fibrosis unless you get 1 copy from your mother and 1 from your father.
Yeah.
But if you have 1 copy, you're called a carrier. But carriers don't really show any disorder at all. So you don't know if you're a carrier or not unless you're tested. Now, the thing is, most people didn't know they're carriers until they have a child, and the child has the disorder, cystic fibrosis. That means both parents had to be carriers. And that's not a good way to find out you're a carrier.
Yes.
So we talked last time about doing testing of couples, and and for a few £100, you could actually see if you're carriers for any of the, theoretically 7,000, 10,000 single gene disorders, but there's 2, 3, 400 that are common enough that you should be concerned about them. And so if you did that, it's a long-winded story, but it's really relevant to your results in a way. Because
Yes.
if you know now on the basis of that test, you're a carrier for some of these things. I don't know if you're married.
I'm not, but I
No.
do know that I'm a carrier for 3 things, so I'll bring
Right.
those up after.
And so given this information, you might say, dead cheap to find out if the person you want to marry is also a carrier.
Yeah.
And then if you do that, then you've got the issue of, but what do you do about it?
Yeah.
So as I said last time, one possibility is there's many fish in the sea. You could try again, but you can also have kids. But if you did that, you'd probably want to do IVF, and then you get into embryo screening, which is the big, hot new thing.
Yes.
And so Nucleus Genomics was providing this carrier testing. I think they've done it for about 5,000 or 15,000. They've done it for a lot of people. So this isn't just like something they might do. They're really doing it. And I
Yes.
think it's a wonderful service to provide, because if everybody did this, you could not eliminate, but really cut down on the number of single gene disorders. And these are not nice. I mean, they're really bad news. So I think it's a wonderful step forward. But then what they were finding at Nucleus Genomics is they're successful in the sense they're pointing out that some couples, like you and your mate, you're both are carriers. So then people say, well, but what do we do? And the obvious thing is IVF.
Yes.
Nucleus Genomics isn't set up for that. So they joined forces. They partnered a few months ago with Genomic Prediction, which got a lot of publicity a few years ago because they were the first company offering embryo testing. So these are probably all issues we get into anyway, so I might as well kind of explain them now. So if you do IVF, you have to superovulate the woman. It's not a fun thing to do. People aren't going to do this just for kicks. So you do hormones for several months. You superovulate. That is, you produce as many eggs as possible. Then you
Yes.
harvest those eggs. And in vitro fertilization means you fertilize the eggs in a test tube. These are test tube babies. So and some women are freezing their eggs. That's kind of a big thing right now. Women who are getting older and they don't, they want to save their eggs. And so in vitro fertilization has been done for quite a while now to say, if you and your wife are carriers for cystic fibrosis, you'd expect that 1/4 of those eggs. So then you fertilize them with your sperm, and you get embryos.
Yes.
And when they're at a fused cell stage, you could actually extract a cell and test for that cystic fibrosis mutation. You'd expect 1/4 of them, of the embryos, to actually have the disease. That is 2 copies of the mutation. But that's, say, if you had 8 embryos, that's 2 out of 8. So you're left with 6. So then what do you do? Well, in the past, they used to just kind of look at the ones and say, well, that one looks a little fatter and healthy or whatever. It wasn't very predictive. But now, if you can do genetic testing, as you did for cystic fibrosis gene, you could say, well, two of these others have maybe dangerous mutations, really, so they'd be obvious that you wouldn't want to implant them. You
Yeah.
can, in the UK at least, only implant one. Now, we could talk about it later. Elon Musk's, has 14 children by 4 different women, and they were all IVF, but they were implanting more than one because one of them had 5 kids, but that was one triplet
Yeah.
and one pair of twins.
I'm curious if you think that we should be able to do that. There's loads of questions that is going to
Yeah,
come
yeah.
up in this podcast on should we be allowed to do that? What should we regulate for?
Yeah.
Triplets is an example that might seem harmless and maybe is. Do you
No.
think
No,
no?
it's not. The reason in the
Or
UK they will only allow one embryo to be implanted is because, despite what people think, IVF is very successful.
yes.
So 75% of the women who do IVF will expect after 1 year, maybe that's 2 rounds of IVF, to be successfully impregnated. So it's too successful. And you think, well, why not just have 2 kids, 2 for 1? But the reason is that it's a medical risk, a definite medical risk. We're not like cows or dogs who are meant to have litters.
Right.
And so it is a medical risk to have twins, and triplets are even more of a risk. So even at that level of just simple medical risk, it's not good to implant more than one.
That's risk to the mother and the embryos, and is a greater chance of miscarriage for
That's
every.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And also and other problems that come up. They're born very light, and
Right.
often have to go into intensive care, and so that creates a lot of medical risks. But
Right.
that's sort of getting us off topic here in a way. The topic you raised is, should we be allowed to do this? Well, that is a very big issue that we should get into. But I just wanted to finish this story then of IVF and PGT, as it's called, prenatal genetic testing. And
Yes.
there's different flavors of it. One we've been doing for a long time, and that's PGT-A, where you just test for its aneuploidy, which means multiple chromosomes. So
Yes.
the most common form of mental uh, disability is Down syndrome. It's been known since 1957 to be due to a trisomy of chromosome 21.
Yeah.
So you've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. Chromosome 21 is the tiniest chromosome. And you can, just by a mix-up with when you're creating eggs and sperm, you could have an extra copy of chromosome 21. And that is the cause of Down syndrome. And the thing about it is, women have all their eggs at birth when they're born, and these eggs are sitting around a long time. And the idea is that as women get older, their risk for aneuploidy, like chromosome 21 trisomy, Down syndrome, is greatly increased. So
Yes.
much so that I think in the UK now, it's required if a woman's over 40. Well, at least it's required that the NHS provides a test for them. And I think it's gone down to 35 now. And it turns out that most women, despite all the concerns about abortion, because that's what it means, sort of, is that you're willing to abort a child if you find
Yes.
out the child has Downs. Now, there's huge ethical issues here. Some people are really concerned about it. What's wrong with Downs people? They're nice. They have a shorter lifespan and everything. So there's lots of issues there. But in
Yeah.
fact, most women who find out they have a Downs child abort.
Yes.
So that's been going on for a long time. And now with carrier testing, people are choosing embryos. The only reason they did the IVF is to find out which 25% of their embryos would have a double dose. And obviously they're not going to implant those. That was the whole point of this. But
Yeah.
then the thing I wanted to get to is saying, now you're left with 6. Okay. And maybe 2 of them have some other problem, but now you've got 4. And you could just say, perfectly legitimate, ethically, is to say, well, let's just pick one at random.
Yeah.
But, not to choose is to choose. And what if instead I told you this one has like a 5-fold increased risk for severe heart attack by
Right.
mid 40s?
Yeah.
And this one has, 10-fold greater risk for schizophrenia. But then what people are also wanting to do, and it's genomic prediction said they didn't provide this information. Intelligence. It's actually the thing people want to know most. Parents want to
Right.
know most. But if you were paying $50,000, as I think the average $50,000, which I think was the average cost for genomic prediction back then, it's all gone down now because there's several other companies doing this. Um, and you said, but that's my information. Who are you to tell me? I can't find out. And there's a lot of work recently to say, siblings are 50% similar genetically. So you're not going to get the spread of, say, IQ scores that you would in the population, sort of like half of it in a way. But it does turn out if, as is generally the case, you have 5 embryos, good embryos to choose from, when you've eliminated 2 that have the recessive disorder, um, if you chose the ones with the highest polygenic score for IQ, you can the range would be from 95 to 105. So I'm sure
Yeah.
everybody knows the average IQ is 100, and if they know statistics, this will be meaningful. The standard deviation is 15. But just at a practical level, 95 to 105. That means the parents are of average IQ, because if
Yeah.
their average IQ is 130, of course, this would be a range, way up there. But
Yeah.
just say, on average, people have an IQ of 100. If a couple with IQs of 100 have a child and they go through this procedure and they had 5 embryos, expected range would be from 95 to 105. And so what does that mean? That's the average IQ difference between people who don't finish high school and people who finish high school.
Right.
Or it's the average IQ difference between people who finish high school and people who go to university. So, it's not a monstrous difference, but for a lot of parents, that is a big enough difference that they wouldn't just throw that information away.
For sure.
But, I know the point you're getting to, and there's a lot of people who are worried about designer babies. We've talked about it for a long time. But Gattaca is here. Did we talk last time about Gattaca?
Yes.
Film, yeah. The 1997 film. It was so prescient. I can't believe it. Even though it was before the Human Genome Project, they got all the predictions right about DNA identification, where you can, but then also DNA dating. There was actually part of it. But the big ones are prenatal testing and postnatal testing. That
Yeah.
was kind of the heart of the film. But with the prenatal testing, what they did is they superovulated and had lots of embryos to choose from. Because the more embryos you choose from, I said 5, which is the average. But some women with frozen eggs, for example, or others, will do this several times and they'll get 10, 20 embryos. But you have to genotype each of them, and that's typically about $2,500 a go. This is really high-tech sort of stuff. You got to get one cell from an embryo and genotype that cell, and then you do it for the other embryo and the other embryo. So
Right.
it's a very high-tech procedure, but it is $2,500 to go. But for a lot of parents, Elon Musk especially,
Money doesn't matter
what does
to
that
him.
matter? Yeah. So that's, I think, that's why recently, I don't know if you heard about this company that Elon Musk used, his latest girlfriend.
No.
It's called Orchid, Orchid, and their sort of byline, it's total Gattaca. The byline is sex is for fun, embryo testing is for babies.
Wow. That's
So they're really going all out on this.
right.
And when you get them, and where is their maternity clinic? Beverly Hills. So when you see stuff like that happening, this is happening. Like it or not, it's happening. And right
Right.
now, it's only happening for rich people. So there's a whole lot of things to unpack here. But what I would like people to know is you would have been crucified 10 years ago for even mentioning this.
Yeah.
Gattaca wasn't promoting this. It was a dystopia saying how this will destroy society. But for reasons I don't agree with. It was a totalitarian government forcing people to do this stuff. And if you didn't do it, you couldn't get a decent job or education or anything. So there's so much to unpack here. But the reason I wanted to bring this out at the beginning is because when we go through your results, most people will say, yeah, I don't really have any bad mutations that are going to mess me up. And yeah, maybe I know about how my urine smells after I eat asparagus. But in some cases it's meaningful.
Yeah.
Like for me, my highest polygenic score was for body mass index. And I've always had a problem with weight. And it's actually comforting to know. And it makes a very important point. People say, well, if you knew your genetic predictions, you just say, well, nothing I can do about that. Eat, drink, and be merry, But to the contrary, I find it's motivating. I know it isn't just a few pounds I put on over Christmas. It's like I've got a real lifelong battle here to keep my weight down.
Right.
So we can see that about you, but most people would say, nah, it's not life-changing what I found out from my genetic testing information. But where it comes in is when you decide to get married and have kids.
Yeah.
And I think by the time you have kids in the next few years, this is going to be really commonplace that rich people are doing it. And so one more thing I'll say, I'm just kind of putting it all out there.
No, set it up. I think you're setting up the conversation so well. These are all things I wanted to dive into, and we'll go down in depth into all of them, but set the context.
Okay,
Keep going.
one last thing here about Ireland has, on the basis of cystic fibrosis, has, unlike a lot of other countries, they're screening newborns. Now we've been screening newborns since the 1940s, but we did it for like phenylketonuria, a cause of 1% of severely mentally disabled individuals. But we added to that list more and more, and in the UK, testing for about 12, but they've now just decided to test for 250 single gene mutations at birth. But now, if you're going to do it at birth, with cystic fibrosis, all you'll know is that the kid has cystic fibrosis.
Right.
You start to intervene earlier, but there's no cure for it. And there's about a dozen medications you have to take. It's tough. But if you're going to do that, why not screen prenatally?
Yeah.
So that's where it's going to go. And I know people have a heart attack when you say that, but given what I see happening in the last few months even, I can confidently say this is happening.
Yes, absolutely. Great news. If you were thinking of getting your own genetics test done, then Nucleus Genomics, the leading consumer company for genetic testing, is giving my audience 10% off their first test with the code EVAN10. The whole process is super smooth and simple, and you'll get a really intuitive breakdown of everything that you need to be aware of within your DNA. Your breakdown will include risk scores for different conditions that you might be predisposed to. Oftentimes with this information, you'll be able to take proactive steps for your health. For example, in my test, I found that I have 2 rare mutations that predispose me to a condition called hemochromatosis. This is a condition where my body can't really break down iron very well, and hence it starts to accumulate, which can cause a bunch of negative side effects like inflammation and brain fog. It means that I should get my blood tests done every single year, and I need to be specially aware of my iron levels. But even more importantly, this information is also relevant for my dad, who's always commented about having high iron levels. So your genetics test is of course not just for you, but also for your family, who might discover something important and actionable as well. Get your genetics test done today for 10% off using my link in the description. I really could not recommend Nucleus Genomics more. I think that was really well set up. And I think it's relatively uncontroversial, the monogenic disorders side. I think people can, of course, agree that we should be screening for that earlier, because really there's no benefit to society to have cystic fibrosis. At least that, there's a lot of benefit to neurodivergence, and we'll get into the specific cases. But things like cystic fibrosis, things like Huntington's, there's just no benefit for that. I could imagine when you have all of these polygenic risk scores, that it could create a bit of anxiety on the side of the parent. Like, how do they weigh up, 5% greater chance of having an IQ of 120 relative to 115 versus a 200% chance in schizophrenia, even though that's a low risk factor? Like, Kian Sadeghi, who is the CEO of Nucleus, as we were talking about, said that he might choose an embryo with a high risk of schizophrenia. And he might have been saying that a little bit tongue in cheek to be a bit controversial, but it's because schizophrenia can be highly correlated with creativity. So all of these things are double-sided coins, right? We don't just select for altruism because there's another side of that altruistic coin. And like, I can imagine quite a lot of anxiety being on the parent of like seeing this dashboard of embryos, and I'll put it up on the screen, and like trying to weigh up intelligence versus height versus chance of schizophrenia versus chance of heart disease when they're 40 versus chance of colorectal cancer when they're 60 versus Alzheimer's versus like, how do you even think about that decision? It's very complicated.
Yeah, but it's I think knowledge is power myself.
Yeah,
And
I would agree. And I'm not saying this is a reason that we shouldn't do it, but
I would like to say that with PGT, prenatal genetic testing, there's PGT-A, which is this aneuploidy, testing for chromosomal anomalies.
Yes.
And that's uncontroversial. It's been done for a long time.
Absolutely.
But we can now do it as part of this DNA test rather than doing a separate test for chromosomes.
Yes.
Then there's PGT-M, which is for monogenic, single gene disorders. And as you're saying, although that used to be highly controversial, it's not controversial now. Yeah. In our last interview, you said, but what about, what did you call it? Amplifying? What is the word? Augmenting.
Yes.
But the thing is that single gene mutations are bad. There aren't like single gene mutations that make you a genius. Some people think there is, that a genius has some, but it's not, it doesn't work that way. The machine is very finely tuned and multiply determined. So I'm not aware of any single gene mutation that has a big benefit for you.
Yes.
So I don't think that's going to happen.
I can give the exact number on it just to support your point. So on the intelligence polygenic score that Nucleus does, it includes 558,032 common genes. And I'm curious in your thoughts on how you get 558,000 genes and create a score from it. It's fascinating, but that's how many factors are in your intelligence, just to support your point.
It isn't.
Yes.
This has to do with how you create polygenic scores. There are 600,000 SNPs. You didn't do whole genome sequencing, did you?
Well, I did the full package with Nucleus. I don't think I have access to the full genome. I just have traits, SNPs, about 1,000 traits.
Well, as we said last time, up until recently, the way genetic testing was done by these direct-to-consumer companies was to use what's called a SNP chip, which has been around since since about 2008 or 9. And it has about now 600,000 SNPs, these single nucleotide polymorphisms. Now, when you create a polygenic score, the bad thing that some companies do is, this has to do with these genome-wide association studies we talked about, which look at throughout the whole genome. They say, which of these 600,000 SNPs is related to the trait you're interested in, whether it's a disorder or intelligence. So what the bad thing to do is to say, well, just take the top hits, 3 or 4 hits. And it is a polygenic score, but we know it's pretty worthless compared to taking thousands of SNPs. And so the way it's done now is to say, let's just take all the SNPs, and if they're not, and look at their effect size, that is how much they're related to the trait. So when the effect sizes go down to 0, they don't count for anything. But all you're really doing is you're saying, let's keep adding SNPs as long as they add to the prediction in an independent sample. That's the key issue. And if they add to our prediction, we don't care if there's 3,000, 30,000, or 300,000. So when Nucleus says they've got 538,000, that's really just the SNPs on the chips. But typically 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 SNPs will actually add something. Even if they only add a tiny, tiny amount, that's okay. We'll take it.
I was kind of uncertain. That was really well explained, but I was kind of uncertain how to interpret that result. I was unsure if that meant that the model was more or less accurate, because I'll give some context to this, because I'll go through a few of these traits and I'll give the amount of genes that are in the polygenic risk score for each of these different things. So Depression was 558,415. So I thought that was very interesting because that's basically the same number as in IQ is in intelligence. And I wasn't also sure how to interpret that.
But you see now why it is that same number? That's just all the SNPs on the chip.
Right.
I said 600,000 SNPs, but
Yes.
some of them you discard because of quality control issues.
Yes. But then if you go to average longevity, for some reason it only includes 332 genes in longevity. And I would have thought longevity is a really all-encompassing multifactorial type thing,
Yeah.
but you can include all disease risk factor in longevity, right? So that's why I was kind of confused why there was so few there, because I actually would think that you would include all disease risk, because obviously disease risk affects longevity.
Yeah. I don't know specifically, but I do know two things. Longevity isn't very heritable,
Okay.
despite what people think.
That's weird, isn't it?
Well, sort of, but there's a lot of things that can kill you.
Yeah.
And it is the case, though, later in life, it becomes more heritable. Like if you
Yeah.
survive to 80, it makes more of a difference if your parents, like mine, live to be 97. But
Right.
it's not very heritable first. And second, you're stuck with the summary statistics from the genome-wide association studies that have been done. So my guess is, in the case of longevity, they only provide SNP summary information for those top 300 and whatever SNPs. Most GWAS, genome-wide association studies, would now present summary statistics for all 500, 600,000 SNPs that are generally available. And it gets even more complicated because these 600,000 SNPs were chosen because they are spread out across the genome. And the reason for that is we have 3 billion base pairs of DNA, but because a SNP that's close to a gene that makes a difference for a trait captures some of that prediction because they're close together on a chromosome, which means they don't get split up during recombination. So one more little fact here, if people aren't befuddled already, is when you create eggs or sperm, that's a process called meiosis, where you get the chromosome splits and each half creates another half. That's mitosis. That's all the cells of our body. That's how it duplicates. Meiosis is a special thing that happens in your ovaries and testes, where you create a copy. I mean, you split the chromosomes, but each one is a separate chromosome because it's called haploid, because you want the egg to have half the chromosomes and then
Yes.
the sperm has half that chromosome. So that's what fertilization's about, and you get a full chromosome. But the trick is, before meiosis happens, on average, each chromosome combines. So they recombine like this. So you got a pair of chromosomes. Before they go through meiosis, they do this thing of crossing over, and then they split. So now you've got half and half. It creates genetic variability.
Yes.
And that's really what sex is all about, is creating variability. But that means that the closer together two DNA variants are on a chromosome, the less likely they'll be split apart.
Right.
And so that means if you're in a region of a chromosome that doesn't split apart, doesn't recombine very much, one SNP down here can very well predict a DNA marker up here, even if you don't have it.
Right.
Now, so this is all very complicated, but this has been worked out for almost a century now. About
I'll
this.
leave some graphics on the screen to help
Okay.
through that, because I think even people who've studied biochemistry, neuroscience, genetics can get confused by those exact words and process.
Yes.
So I'll leave some diagrams and descriptions and definitions, etc.
But the final point of this, though, is SNP chips are now being replaced by whole genome sequencing. So
Yes.
rather than just kind of getting an index, getting 600,000 markers across the genome, DNA, a whole genome sequencing gets all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. So there's no guessing there. That's all the information you've got.
Yes.
And that used to be incredibly expensive, but now places like Nucleus Genomics are doing it for, you didn't pay, presumably. They did it for you for.
No, I was sponsored. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's on it's less than 1,000, isn't it?
Yeah, $500, $500.
for the whole genome sequencing.
Yeah, and I think you always get a
Amazing.
free you get a free test with that, so it's kind of two for that price, and they always kind of gift you one extra one, so you can give it to a partner. I think is the
Wow.
idea.
Ah,
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay, so that just got you started. But I did want to say PGTA, chromosomal anomalies, PGTM, monogenic, no longer really controversial, for at least for carrier parents.
yeah.
But then PGTP is polygenic score, and that's where a lot of the controversy comes in,
Yes,
right? And so I just think increasingly people are going to do IVF like Elon Musk, not for carrier testing, but they'll certainly screen PGTM. They screen for monogenic disorders,
yeah,
but they're also doing it for PGTP, polygenic scores. And, that's straight designer baby stuff.
right.
But as I said, this new company, Orchid, they actually are advertising that.
Yeah, they're leaning fully into the future, hoping that this will become completely commonplace in 10 years. They're fringe now and they'll get some popularity in some newspaper headlines now, but they'll just be mainstream.
Yeah.
Which is why I think these conversations are so important now, because
Mhm.
I think there's so many ethical, moral issues that are coming up that we'll be making decisions about them in maybe 5 years, but it means we will need to have a good few years of talking about them before we can figure out how we should think about it. Like it's hard to know if placing artificial selection on things like intelligence won't have negative consequences, because again, what's on the other flip side of intelligence? It's hard to know, but maybe it's schizophrenia. I mean, maybe there's some evidence for that. Maybe it's, I don't know, there could be loads of things like immune system. We just don't know. Like, we don't really know what placing artificial selection on traits will have. Like, do you think it's a reasonable hypothesis that it could do something like reduce immunity? It could reduce physical stature, muscular,
Yeah.
even, schizophrenia does seem to be correlated in strange sort of ways. Maybe you can talk to that. But like, what effects will we see by placing artificial selection on these traits that we don't fully understand?
Right. Well, um, first, I think it's important to point out that we do select anyway. As I said last time,
Right.
assortative mating is a big thing for intelligence. I think the general issue you're raising is unintended consequences,
Right.
and
Just,
that's a
yeah.
huge topic at the level of single genes. So I know at some point last time we mentioned it, gene editing, cystic fibrosis. It was the first single gene disorder that gene editing was used for, but in
Yeah.
the first case, the baby died due to unintended consequences.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But that was a long time ago. But still, gene editing is not routinely done for cystic fibrosis. It's increasingly becoming the case for some blood disorders, single gene recessive blood disorders. But there, you're changing a gene. You're taking out a mutation and you're putting in a good copy of the gene. But even then, it's such a finely balanced system. DNA is the same code across all carbon-based life, and it's evolved for millions of years. And so it's very finely tuned. And so you go changing things at your peril. I mean,
Yes.
for all the reasons you're saying. But now
Yeah.
with polygenic scores, you're not changing genes.
Yes.
You're
At the
using,
moment, at least, you're not. I know you may be skeptical of polygenic gene therapy in the future, but I don't see why not in 10 years, based on this exponential development of gene technology. Can we target entire clusters? And we may or may not know what the hell we're doing when we decide to, but I think we'll have technology, 10, 20, 30 years, who knows,
yeah,
right?
but I don't know. I think gene editing is hyped even for single gene disorders, but especially for polygenic disorders,
Yeah.
because you have to change them in the first cell, don't you, of life?
Yes, because if it's multiplied, you have to edit every cell.
And then you got trillions of cells, but so we can't
Yes.
go into your brain and do any gene editing.
Yes.
So I think that makes it really difficult. But here we're using naturally occurring genetic variation. And as I say, we already do some of that when we assort matatively. Um, you know, I think we mentioned last time that the highest assortative mating, that is, where like uh, mates with like, is for verbal intelligence.
Yeah.
And as we said last time, you may not know it. You may think it's hard to measure these things. It's not. Vocabulary is easy to measure. But the fact is, you measure it. If you're going into a singles bar and you talk to someone for 5 minutes, you get a sense of their verbal IQ.
Yes.
And that is a big factor in your selection, because you got to be able to talk to them the next morning, that sort of thing. So,
Yeah, of course.
so I do think this goes on already. You see, what we're doing is skirting the word eugenics in a way.
Yeah.
But it's got such a bad rap. But when Galton suggested the title, the name eugenics, "eu" means good, so it's good genetics. It's selecting for positive characteristics.
Yes.
And that seems a lot better than what people think about, which is dysgenics, which is like sterilizing people who you don't like or killing them. I mean,
Yeah.
so there's so many very big, scary issues here. I certainly
Yes.
agree. But I would say with polygenic scores, um, in the situation, say, where you're carrier testing, you go in, you've got extra embryos left. I think few parents I don't think they choose the option of, well, just pick one by chance when you've got 4 embryos left. And as you're saying, it gets very tricky, right? Because how do you balance medical risk against intelligence or whatever? So there's some videos of people who have done this recently that are probably worth looking at. And
Yeah,
then,
that's
I
very
mean, it's just
interesting.
the
I
way
haven't
you
seen
are.
that.
They're saying, well, we kind of like to have a kid who's not super short. That's
Yeah.
maybe their preference. How about male or female? Musk is only choosing males. I mean, that's a pretty difficult issue. What would that lead to in the end? Like in
Exactly.
India, where there's a huge excess of males, right?
Yes.
Um, so, uh, so
These are really good examples of exactly what I'm talking about. Like, what will these selection pressures do to on a population level, generation after generation?
yep, yeah. Well, we know there's been attempts to do this at a grosser level, like the one-child policy in China, where we know there was a lot of infanticide that went on.
Yeah.
And in India, I think it is India, isn't it, where there's a great preponderance of males, that leads to
Yes.
problems. That's all before, um, that infanticide is sort of like the worst version of this. It isn't IVF, we're talking about.
Yes.
So, yeah, I'm, as I say, there's a lot of people concerned about these issues. And as I say in my book, Blueprint, I'm a cheerleader because I can see a lot of good that comes from this.
Yeah.
And if I were a parent having gone through IVF and I'm left with this dilemma of which to choose, I'd do like these parents do on the videos. They're not a random sample because they've gone through IVF and they're paid a lot of money to do this.
Yeah.
So they're not a random sample, but I think their reasoning is pretty good, just as you're saying. Well, they have like a twofold greater risk of type 2 diabetes, and there's this and there's that, and there's a lot of information to balance. And in the end, they just uh, made a choice, knowing that there wasn't much in it, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
I, I'm really thinking about what I would do in my scenario. I hope to have
Sure.
children in a few years. And I think what we 100% agree on is, I would like I've already done genetic sequencing. I would like my partner to, if there's any, real risk there in terms of carrier genes, we would do IVF. And if I was in the scenario where I was looking at this dashboard of 8 embryos, and I think what I would like is almost a polygenic disease risk, like one score that kind of weights all diseases by the severity of the disease, by the prevalence. And then I would discard all of the highest ones for just general disease risk. And I know that's very hard because there's just so much disease risk, but maybe you could get a pretty good
Sure.
score. And weight that by the severity of the disease, of course. I think once disease risk is out of the way, at the moment, I would say I would maybe roll the dice. I don't know if I want to be making intelligence decisions. I don't know if I want to be making height decisions. I don't know if I want to be making, maybe BMI is different. See, it's weird. It's really strange.
But
And
that
like,
that is the point. I mean, for some people,
right.
BMI would be a deal breaker, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And it's hard to say that these things do affect people's lives. They do affect their mental health.
yeah.
I
What
am,
what about gender? You wouldn't select on gender, would you?
no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No.
I think it's illegal in the UK. I'm not sure, but I think it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you this as well. There's very different legislation already in the world for what you can do. I don't believe you can do polygenic scores. It might depend on the type of polygenic score in most of Europe. You can't. Is this right? I believe you can't get the same IQ polygenic scores in the UK, but you can in the US. I don't think you can in France. I think you might need to go through the medical system. You might need to have some legal basis for some polygenic scores, but I don't know if Nucleus could offer their exact service in Europe as it stands
No,
today.
I mean, even 23andMe, as I understand it in France, you can't do it. You have
Right.
to go through another European country to do it.
Yes.
France has always been a bit weird about anything to do with DNA. Some people say because
Interesting.
of fears of false paternity.
Right.
That's another thing we haven't raised.
Particular issue in France.
Yeah.
to,
Cinq,
to, to out the cheaters, that's a
cinq
funny
à sept.
moral.
Do you know French at all? Cinq à sept is 5 to 7. You're not supposed to ask your spouse what they're doing after work between 5 and 7.
Oh my God. You think France are taking a moral stance, but it's just because they don't want to be found out from their infidelity.
I don't know, but it underlines your point that there's a great heterogeneity of rules and laws here. But you're balancing the, it, you got three things to balance: the parents' rights, the infants' rights,
Yes.
the not yet born infants' right, and then society too. Because you could say, like in the case of Downs, and I have a very good friend who knew she had Downs twins and went ahead and have the child. But, it's
Wow.
not just her, and, bless her for doing this,
Yeah.
but it's a big burden on society, and that can't be
Yeah.
ignored. I mean,
Yeah.
we're paying for all that. And, so it's a very tricky issue all the way around here. But I
Well,
think
what if you put yourself in that shoes? If you wind back a couple of years and
a
you're
couple
having
decades, I'm
a few
afraid.
years, a couple five or 10 years, and you're in prime child rearing ages. Like, what do you think you would like to select for? What would you not want to, especially now with all your experience of having children? Like, how does that change it? I'm really curious on your take. What things would you like to select for? What things
Yeah.
wouldn't?
Well, first of all, as these companies all emphasize, it's probabilistic, as we said last
Yes.
time. It's not deterministic.
Yes.
And the single gene disorders are, if you had that, it's a dominant mutation for Huntington's disease, which you mentioned. And that's Woody Guthrie, the wonderful film about Bob Dylan, that just came out. That's fantastic. Where if you have that mutation, you will die from Huntington's
Yeah.
in mid 60s or so, and it's a horrible neural degeneration, very bad thing. So that's deterministic and hardwired. But when you talk about polygenic scores, it's completely probabilistic. It's not deterministic. So one of the best predictors we have is for body mass index, for weight, or actually for height is the very best one. We can predict 40% of the variance in height. Now it's about 80% heritable, which means we're not predicting about half of the genetic variance. I think most people would accept that height is very highly heritable.
Yes.
Um, but not 100%. There are illnesses and other things, nutritional stuff, whatever, that makes somewhat of a difference. But height is the most predictive trait we have. But when you're choosing these embryos, you pick the one, say, if you want your kid to be a basketball player, you pick the
Right.
one with the very highest polygenic score for height. And it'll make some average difference. But for that one kid, it's very probabilistic. And it could even be just an average sized child.
Yep.
Because, and yet that's by far the most predictive trait we have. And
Funnily though, in mine, my Nucleus results was 11 centimeters off my real height. So it said I was 172 centimeters and I'm 183. So interestingly enough, that it's the most predictive, and just in this incidence of trait, it was 11 centimeters off, which was a foot, which is pretty interesting.
yeah, well, that's unusual that it would be that far off.
Right.
Um, but it's a good point, that this
Yeah.
is probabilistic.
Yeah.
But what people don't recognize is how much our lives are probabilistic. I mean, like, you think, like in England, people sign their kids up for the very best schools, nursery schools, primary school, secondary schools, paying hundreds of thousands of pounds. And do they ever stop to ask, what's the effect size? How much
Yeah.
difference does it make? And I've done research, and lots of people have saying it makes very little difference. What
Yeah.
it is those schools are selecting kids who are likely to be good students. They're not adding much value to that, which I know is shocking for some parents who change their lives in order to do this. But the reason the parents do it is they want to give their kids that little edge, whatever little edge there is. But the thing is, DNA is a bigger edge than these edges they're banking on.
Right.
And that's what's going to sink in eventually.
So I agree with all of that, but I'm really curious on your personal decisions. Maybe I don't know if you're
Yeah.
comfortable sharing this because it is quite personal as a conversation, but I just think they're very important.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
which
like you, I'd certainly screen out the monogenic disorders.
right.
And then beyond that, like you, I think that's a very good point. Screen out the medical disorders. And you can kind of figure it out yourself, what you were saying about, well, this one it's not very predictive. It's a lower risk, but if you got it, it's bad. How bad? If someone could put those together and
Yeah.
come up with a composite risk, that would be good. But even there's some subjectivity. Like, how bad would type 2 diabetes be in your mind? I mean, some people would say, oh God, anything terrible. I don't want it. Well, type
Right.
2 diabetes is quite manageable these days.
Yeah.
So, it'd be hard to come up with one number, but I hear what you're saying. But the reason you're saying that is you want to make the decision easier. You want to just
Yes.
say,
Of
here's
course.
just one number, and okay. But then we're sort of agreeing on that. You'd look at the medical conditions first.
Yeah.
Although people don't understand that some of those polygenic scores are less good than the ones for behavior. That is, they're less predictive. Like,
Yes.
one thing people are surprised by, cancer is not very heritable at all.
Very interesting.
And so polygenic score, cancer involves DNA, but it's not inherited DNA. These are mutations you pick up during life. Most obviously, skin cancer. You don't
Yes.
inherit that. The sun, exposure to the sun, is mutating some cells, and then they go wild in their lack of regulation, And so that's
Yeah.
cancer is us, but it's not inherited. So you get a disease, you get a polygenic score for cancer, like prostate cancer is one of the more heritable ones. People are surprised with Angelina Jolie, for example, to find out breast cancer is not very heritable at all. But there are those BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes that if you got them, they're very rare, but if you got them,
Yes.
they're bad news. So lots of complications here, but the point is, how do you say you get a polygenic score for some, even prostate cancer? It's not very heritable. And the prostate and the polygenic score probably didn't involve huge samples, so it's not very good. It's not very predictive of that relatively low, that risk. So how do you balance that? Because some people you say cancer and they, oh God, can't have that. But actually, it might not be that important a risk.
Yes.
So it's a complicated deal there. Okay, so medical, difficult enough.
Yes.
Now let's think about things like schizophrenia, intelligence, all the
Creativity,
psychological.
extroversion, risk taking. Like there's an infinite amount of directions that you can
Yeah,
do it, right? That's why
yeah,
it's so hard.
right. But you ask about me, and I know that
Yeah.
the polygenic scores for personality, there's a new one coming out that is based on 5.1 million people. And the reason
Okay.
the genome-wide association study, the reason these huge samples are necessary, because the main thing we've learned is that heritability is not due to a handful of genes. For these complex disorder traits or common disorders like heart disease, and the vast majority of medical burden in our society is due to these complex disorders that are influenced by many, many genes. And we now know many, many isn't 6, 12, 24. We're talking about thousands of tiny effects.
Yeah.
But to pick up a tiny effect, if you've had any statistics, you need huge samples. And so that's been the name of the game in the last decade, is getting bigger and bigger samples to scoop up more of these small, tiny effects. And so even this recent study of personality, self-reported personality with 5.1 million, they're still not very predictive. They're predicting maybe 6, 7% of the variance. Now, the thing is, we're focused on effect size, and most psychological research doesn't think about how big an effect. They're saying statistically significant. I don't know if you've ever gotten into this with your interviews, but that's just a function of sample size in a way. You can have
Yes.
a tiny, tiny effect that's statistically significant. The real issue is how much variance are you explaining? And when
Yeah.
people poo-poo these polygenic score results, oh, you're only explaining 5%, 10% of the variance. You say, yeah, and what can you predict?
Yeah.
And what can you predict at birth? What can you predict prenatally? And it's rare in the behavioral sciences to predict 5% of the variance. Yet with the polygenic scores for IQ or school achievement, we're explaining 15%, getting close to 20% of the variance. It's a long way from 100%. It's only 60% heritable, and it's a long way from 60%. So there's headroom there to get more predictive. But even
Yes.
at 15%, that is when I talked about quality of schools and people spending huge amounts of money to send their kids to a better school, you're explaining less than 5% of the variance of school achievement. So 15% is 3 times that predictive power.
It's
So
huge.
but it's important to say it's not deterministic. It's still probabilistic, but it's a better probability bet than things that we're betting a lot of money on already. You
Yeah.
know, so
It's a really good point.
really tricky issues here. But, when it comes down to it then, because I know the polygenic score for educational achievement is so much more predictive than any of these other scores, and it does mean a lot to me. When university educated parents adopt a child and they're not aware of genetics, they just say, well, tender loving care will make sure they get flashcards as an infant and everything, and they'll be fine. Well, it's really tough for university educated parents to have a child who doesn't like school, isn't good
Yeah.
at school. I mean, I've learned that,
I would struggle with that as well, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it makes a big deal to parents. It shouldn't make so much of a difference. More and more we need to accept we don't need more PhDs. We need plumbers and nurses and carers.
Yeah.
And, there's all those issues as well. But if you ask me what would be most important to me, I'm afraid I would admit, and I'm sure I'm going to get nailed for this, that intelligence, educational achievement would be pretty high on my list.
So I've been trying to drink less alcohol. And honestly, it's had a pretty big impact on my health. I'm sleeping better, I'm exercising more, and my business is growing. The data suggests that people are drinking less alcohol than ever, which overall I think is great, but I'm still looking for a little treat at the end of the workday or a hard workout. And that's where Sentia comes in. Sentia is a 0% alcohol drink that feels like you're drinking something special without any of the downsides. It's created by neuroscientists and it's designed to give you that relaxing buzz. The same kind of feeling you get from alcohol, but without the hangover, brain fog, or impact on sleep quality. And it tastes absolutely delicious. They already have a GABA red berry, which is perfect to mix with a tonic or orange, or GABA black, which is awesome with Coke. Personally, I've been really enjoying the GABA gold with Fanta lemon on ice. It's actually genuinely delicious. Like, I'm not even play acting there. It's actually just really, really good. So you might be wondering, how does a drink with 0% alcohol give you that buzz? It almost sounds too good to be true. Well, this is the really cool neuroscience part. The secret is GABA, the brain's natural calming agent. And the different GABA flavors have different cognitive effects. Sentia's founder, Dr. David Nutt, has published over 500 independent research papers and written 34 books on neuropharmacology. What Dr. Nutt realized was that we can harness the same calming, relaxing effects from alcohol without any of the side effects. I genuinely think this could be the future of drinking. And they're also just releasing their first beer and stout, which as an Irishman I am dying to compare to Guinness. Sentia are offering my viewers 10% off their first purchase, and I genuinely could not recommend it more. I think even if you're looking to just substitute your one gin and tonic on a Tuesday with Sentia, the cumulative health benefits over time will actually be very noticeable. So check out Sentia, again 10% off at checkout. I don't think I disagree with any of that. I'm really curious what's on the other side of that coin though. Educational achievement, selecting for that, it's reasonable maybe to hypothesize that you're also maybe selecting for anxiety in terms of like the people that really feel like they need to do well in tests and put the pressure on themselves to do well and to study. And I know a lot of those people, and I was one of them. for a long time, and they can often have higher anxiety and maybe worse social relationships. Like, it's tough. They're all trade-offs. I spoke to Philip Ball. Are you familiar? So Philip Ball is was that editor at Nature
Oh
for
yes, I know his recent book. Yeah,
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to bring up. So he was editor at Nature for 20 years and has written over 30 books spanning quantum mechanics, engineering, everything. His most recent book is about genetics. And I asked him about polygenic risk scores because I was curious, and he doesn't like them at all because he thinks the chance, I don't want to misrepresent his view here, but he's very cautious people are going to misunderstand them. He thinks there's a lot more unknown, that we're sort of deceiving ourselves into thinking that we know more than we do. That there's a lot that we don't know, and that the scores don't exactly say what the average person thinks they say. And I do get that there's a lot. There's a difficulty in communicating exactly what these scores mean and exactly what the probabilities are, because as you mentioned, there's lots of terms around heritability and like where these numbers are derived or from population specific samples, and like there is a lot of difficulty there maybe for people who aren't
yeah,
fully educated on these things to misrepresent, and then because of that misrepresented idea get a lot of psychological anxiety and get a lot of uncertainty, and
yeah.
there'd just be a lot of consequences from that as well.
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote the book Blueprint, is to give
Yeah.
people the DNA literacy they need to be able to think about these issues. I disagree very much with Philip Ball. I mean, he isn't a geneticist, and I think
Yes.
his book, there's so much stuff out there, this that is negative and doom mongering about it. But as a cheerleader, I would say, why aren't we celebrating one of the biggest findings that have come along? Not only do we show everything's heritable when when I was in graduate school thought nothing was heritable in psychology. Now people accept everything's heritable, not just a little bit. We're talking about amounts, 50% of the variance on average, which is just off the scale in the
Right.
behavioral sciences. And now, and I never thought this would happen in my lifetime, we're able to find some of the genes that predict some of that genetic variance. And these polygenic score predictors predict not just from birth, but prenatally, because your DNA doesn't change, your inherited DNA sequence. That and medicine's moving from cure to prediction, as we talked about last time. To prevent, you have to predict, and DNA is the best early warning system we have. So it isn't just PGT. We're talking about even screening at birth for some of these disorders. Not like with cystic fibrosis, you can't do much, but in general, earlier intervention is better.
Yes,
So there's so much good that comes out of all of this
I agree with that
that
100%.
I'm, but you'd be surprised how few cheerleading voices there are like mine. And
For
it's easy to
sure.
be negative. Yeah, these are all complicated things, as Philip Ball is saying. And yeah, people have trouble understanding risk for single gene disorders.
Yeah,
Try polygenic scores. It's
exactly.
Try probabilistic. I mean, people just it's a lot to take on board, but I see huge strides being made in public acceptance of these things. And I predict with this Elon Musk escapade and Nucleus Genomics, which is doing a serious job on carrier screening, you know, I think you you're not going to that this is unstoppable. The genie's out of the bottle, and people are going to do it. But as you're pointing out, there's lots of issues with that too. And I would hate to see this just become something for the wealthy.
Yes. What side of the regulation would you fall on? Do you think the US are closer to the regulation that we should have, or do you think that some of the blockers that Europe are already putting in, like you can't select for gender in Europe, I believe. I think with IVF you
You,
can't
you
select.
can't in the UK. I don't know if I
I
assume
think in
that's true.
Switzerland you can, but I think across Europe you can't. Like a few of those, like I don't know the answer to. I kind of shrug my shoulders and I'm kind of like I don't know. I am. Which would you do you think you would fall slightly more on the US side of the Europe? Like, should we be allowing people to select gender, select triplets? You already said there is risks and cautions with triplets and twins.
Yeah. I don't know. Trump just a few weeks ago put out one of his many executive orders ordering that there be great expansion of funding for IVF clinics.
Interesting. I didn't hear that.
And, you know,
Very
J.D.
interesting.
Vance and Peter Thiel, who has funded J.D. Vance, are very big on pronatalism.
Yes.
And there are some serious issues there. I mean, I think
Yes.
one of the biggest societal issues is the declining birth rates.
Yes.
So, you know, difficult issues, but I think in the U.S., um, this is going to go wild.
Yes.
You know, so I don't think there was pretty good regulatory stuff in the UK in the US, but with Musk with Doge and Trump, and people don't know it. Vance is a very clever guy. I mean, he's effective, unlike Trump, you know, just firing wildly, you know.
Yeah.
But I think all those signs are that this is going to really take off in the US.
I
And it's
agree.
starting in California, and anything that happens in California happens in the rest of the world eventually.
I think that's one of the things that makes me concerned is when you have capitalism as the driver. So if you have venture-backed companies like Nucleus have raised, I believe, over 30 million from different venture capital funds, he has and the company has a responsibility to their investors to make money. And almost certainly it's going to arrive at a point where there's an opportunity to make money, but has huge concerns ethically and morally around what we're actually doing. But people are going to have to make very hard decisions because, like, I think one thing that we've seen over and over again is that, so if you want to understand human behavior, you follow incentives, right? That's Charlie Munger's thing. Like, where's the incentive? Venture capitalists have an incentive to make money, and hence, when they're arriving at these moral and ethical decisions, say related to gene editing, which we'll get into, and what I think will have insane applications in a few years. Like, how can we expect people in those companies to make the decisions that don't have that financial incentive because they're backed by those investors? Incredibly important decisions. Like I think within a few years we might already be at a time where we can do some gene editing stuff that makes people uncomfortable. Maybe we identify a couple of polygenic traits, but maybe it is one cluster that we can target. And again, I'm going very hypothetical, and we're very uncertain what the outcome in a few generations of starting to edit that cluster could be. But because there's a product behind it, like guarantee 10 IQ points for your child. I know that the counter for that is going to be that's like we're not close to that, and that's really complicated. That's far away. Use an example that might be more likely. Say height or something, an extra 5 centimeters for your child, whatever it is. It really doesn't matter what the example is.
Yeah.
There's going to be something that comes up, and there's going to be people like Peter Thiel, who is exactly who I'd be worried about in terms of his version of staunch capitalism, where I'd be very concerned that the decision makers are having to drive that decision, and regulators are never at the same place as the technology, right? We know the technology develops faster than the regulators.
Yeah.
I mean, genuinely, like, I know I appreciate and understand your optimism, but is there anything there that makes you concerned, that makes you scared?
Sure. But as I said last time, one issue to me is that we need dangerous findings. You know, in psychology, the problem is most of the stuff that people write about, nobody cares. It's not important. It's not going to make a difference. This will make a difference. And I think by having discussions like this, people understand the pros and the cons. I think there's a lot more of the cons out there shouting, and that's why I try to be a cheerleader for this stuff. So um, I I think these are clearly big advances, and any discovery in science can be used for good or bad, and so we've got to try hard to make it used for the good. And it's sort of happening. I mean, the NHS now is going to screen babies for not just a handful of single gene disorders, but they're going to do this sort of DNA testing and look at first for 200 monogenic disorders that are actionable. I mean,
Yes.
who could
Those make
disagree with
complete
that?
sense.
Yeah.
Complete sense.
And
Huge
that's just it
benefit.
with
Absolutely.
IVF. I think this carrier thing is the most important thing, carrier testing for mates. And then, as I say, you kind of fall into this. As you were saying, you don't want to decide. You want to have those 3 or 4 embryos and say, pick one that looks the healthiest.
Yeah.
So that's fine too. But all of this, it's all happening then, and
Yeah.
I know capitalism sounds like a bad word, but in a way, what's different from Gattaca, where it was a totalitarian government dictating that you have to do this.
Yeah.
You have to screen out babies that are going to have, embryos that have the wrong traits, and you've got to select for the ones with the best traits. I mean, no one would like that. But the difference here is instead of capitalism, you could say it's consumer led. You could say the government's not forcing people to do this. They're willing to pay a great deal of money to have this done. And if they're not getting a product that they think is worth it, are they going to spend that money? And so you could call that capitalism, but couldn't you also say it's consumer led and maybe
Yeah.
that's a good thing?
Yeah. Yes, but I'm I completely get what you mean. I guess I'm cautious on what could become consumer led. Like what trend or fad might become consumer led that seems preposterous now, but in 10 years time it isn't. You know, like there's just so many different examples that you could come up with. Like maybe height is one. Like, should we allow people to just start editing for height? And I'm strictly talking about editing now. I'm not talking about screening embryos and picking the tallest one. I'm talking about we have the technology to do IVF. We have your 8 embryos, and we can say, I want that embryo and I want it 5 centimeters taller. And again, it's probabilistic, and maybe the product says it's between 2 and 5 centimeters is our guarantee. Should we allow that?
Well, I think as I said before, I really don't think gene editing is an issue because if you are going to do that, you're going to have to do that in an embryo. You're going to have to put those genes into what? You can't do it in sperm or egg. You have to do it in embryo. And if they have several cells already, you can't do it in each cell.
Yeah.
So it's not just a technical issue. I think it's more of a conceptual issue. Contrast that incredible high-tech, I think, real science fiction approach to saying, why not do it IVF with naturally occurring variation? Because for height, just with 5 embryos, you're talking about more than this 10-centimeter difference.
Right.
Now, it's not getting into 7-foot sort of.
Yeah, people want their NBA player child, like people are banking on.
Do they want 7-foot, kids? Because my son's 6'7", and he feels
Wow.
like a bit of a. You do stand out when you're that tall, and it makes
For sure.
not a freak exactly, but so I don't know that parents would want kids who are, 3 meters tall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think the gene editing thing is an issue, but I don't think that's critical to your argument. I think you can make the same argument with IVF, but the difference is that the unintended consequences are likely to be much less because you're dealing with naturally occurring variation.
Yes.
So that may seem like a subtle semantic point, but I do think it's an important one conceptually, at least.
So do you think that we are a long way away, or do you think it's just impossible that we do have, say, gene therapy for behavior? That's one that is in my head, like incredibly far away now, possibly, but we know that humans are not very good at doing this exponential, technology increase. So we, like in 2000, what was it, $1 million that it cost to sequence a genome? Was
no,
$1 billion? Like
2 billion.
2 billion, right? Exactly. So like it's
people to to do whole genome sequencing for the first genome, the human genome sequence.
Like that's why I'm cautious. I understand now it seems like a pipe dream, but in the last 26 years, if you were to say to a geneticist in the year 2000 when it cost 2 billion, like if I was doing a podcast and it was the year 2000 and it cost 2 billion to sequence a genome, and I was telling them in 25 years it's going to cost $500 for a full genome sequencing, I would presume that they would have a relatively similar reaction to what you're saying now, which is like, not too far in the future. I don't think it's possible. It's too complicated. Like all of these things that we think of hurdles now, we just have no idea what technology is going to come down the pipeline. And like, so it almost means that no matter how hard the technical problem, we will converge on a solution because things are just rapidly evolving. It's just about when.
Yeah. But I know what you're saying. Never say never, and technology is moving very fast. But gene editing for highly polygenic traits with 10,000 DNA variants, okay, maybe there's a few that have a bigger effect, but it
Right.
isn't like there's some that have the biggest effect sizes in these association studies, say for height, 0.02%, 0.0002. I mean, incredibly tiny effects. So it isn't like there's a handful of, pretty big effects, 1%, 2%, and then a bunch of little ones. The biggest ones are extremely small.
Yeah.
So that means doing an awful lot of gene editing. So I don't see why you would do that when the range of variation, for two reasons. One, the range of variation naturally is great. Even, for one woman with her eggs and one man's sperm, the range of embryos that you would get is very wide. But more importantly, I think, just as we were saying with cystic fibrosis and the first attempt at gene editing led to a baby dying. So the unintended consequences are enormous. Even when you're taking a mutation that's bad and you're replacing it with a good gene, a copy of the gene that's good. And the reason it can go bad is it's no small thing. Cutting out one little bad bit of DNA and putting in another one in that right, exact, correct place and nowhere else. Because you put that good gene in another place and it could be lethal.
Right.
So that's even, well, every bit as true on the positive side, the augmentation side. If you've tried to put in genes that increased height, for
Yeah.
example, you corrected not a bad mutation, but you corrected a gene, and these genes are very, very long by and large. But say you even found the spot that really is functional, and you replace it with one that supposedly is transcribed into some product that makes you more likely to be tall. Man, the possibilities for unintended consequences are enormous, I think.
Right.
So that's why I'm really down on the idea of gene editing being a problem. There's lots of problems here, but
Okay.
I disagree with your emphasis on the gene editing problem.
Interesting. That's really interesting to me because I'm definitely not an expert on this, but it seems to me the most runaway slippery slope area we could go to. Say like in 2018 we had the first CRISPR babies that were, I believe, HIV immune. Like that's a weird example of that was very controversial. I don't exactly know the exact result of those babies now. I don't know if they survived, but like things like that are already happening. Like should we try and CRISPR engineer babies and make them HIV? Like that's not something that's out into the future, right? That happened in 2018.
Well, that was a rogue scientist in China, and he went to
Right.
prison for that.
Yes.
He's back and kicking and doing more stuff like that. And everyone thought that was a very weird thing. I mean, to uh, of all the genes you're going to put in, all the mutations you're going to worry about, this is one that's kind of weakly related to resistance to HIV. I mean,
Yeah.
so that was just weird from start to finish, and lots of weird aspects to it. But what about the reasonable ones, the ones that are happening now, like the single gene recessive disorders for all the blood diseases, the thalassemias and that sort of thing, or phenylketonuria, for example, the cause of severe mental disability. Um, I think, CRISPR is an amazing technique that allows, very precise replacement of a bit of DNA. So I think that's definitely going to happen. And I think it's a good thing, but from a cost benefit point of view, why not screen? Why not screen embryo? It's dead cheap compared to that, trying to do the gene editing. And you still have those, those unintended consequences, which I think are enormous because our 3 billion base pairs of DNA evolved over millions of years. And, you just don't go mucking with one little bit of it. And
Right.
that's what natural selection does. It's been mucking with this for a long time, and it's created DNA variants that work in the context of all the other DNA variants that we have. So, um, you know, so I don't know. I think augmentation gene editing, maybe people will probably try to do it, but
I
I
think
think
certainly people will try to do
especially
it.
when you contrast it to how quickly you could make advances with PGT.
Yeah, I'm not even assuming that these decisions are rational, right? I think you have a very rational scientist brain on. I think people will do stuff simply because it's outrageous.
Mhm.
That I think they will follow directions simply because they can and they want to, and that's kind of a little bit scary to me. But if we put that aside for a
Well,
little bit,
one thing though that remind me when you're talking about regulation, do you know in the case of that, gene editing in China with that rogue scientist, there was this famous conference, a Silima conference, 15, 20 years ago, where all the scientists doing research in this area agreed that they would not change the human genome. That is, you could change genes, but you can't change anything that would then be part of the human genome,
the germline, yeah,
the germline, exactly.
yeah,
So, despite that, though, a rogue scientist did it, and I think with these techniques, you can do CRISPR in your garage now. No
yeah,
doubt there are these incels around, messing around with this sort of stuff.
yeah,
As you say, just because you can. But,
yeah,
but you wanna get scary, though, what about engineering viruses that can kill everybody, you know?
right.
So there's an awful lot to worry about here if you're a worrier, and I don't think gene editing of human infants is the even in that case, what I worry about is gene
Right.
warfare, you know?
For sure. And the world is not just all holding hands and singing in a field at the moment. There's a lot of, well, unfortunately, is
That's for sure.
to say the least, there's a lot of hostile governments that are likely experimenting with really strange stuff. I am human,
And
like
not
the
even governments. I worry more about rogue operators.
right, right. I mean,
It's
but
hard
when
to
you
make
get
an atom bomb, but this stuff is really down to cookbooks, you know?
yeah, like I can't remember who told me that. I think it was Dr. William Radcliffe who said that he was very scared of, like all molecules are enantiomers, right? They have right and left hands, and I think all of nature. I might get this mixed up. Is right-handed or left? I think it's all right-handed. Where
I don't know.
I think all of nature is right-handed, and that means that if you make left-handed molecules, the body can't do anything with them. They can't break them down. They just sit there.
Mm,
So, and there's people creating these left-handed enantiomers. And Dr. William Radcliffe, who's a complexity scientist and evolutionary biologist, is really worried that
mm.
if we keep doing things with these left-handed molecules that the human body can't do anything with, if we intake too of them, we consume too many of them, we'll just die because our body can't dispose of them. Sort of like heavy metals, like we
Yeah.
just can't break them down anyway, and they're
Well,
being engineered.
and a more specific example in terms of DNA is the idea of the Chinese lab leak and the idea of doing gene editing for gain of functions. I know it's a complicated topic, but I would recommend people reading Matt Ridley's book, Virus, which is on this topic. He got a lot of flack and still does get flack. It's still controversial. But
Yeah,
I think if there's any chance that this is true, we really have to watch gain of function research. But what's really scary about it is you don't need these major labs to do it.
right.
So I worry much more about that than I would about gene editing humans for,
Elaborate a little bit more. What is the gain of function research mean exactly?
well, according to Matt Ridley, what they were doing in that lab in Wuhan was specifically working on the SARS virus that, became COVID and looking at the bits of the gene that are detected by the human immune system and putting things on it that make it less likely to be detected by the immune system and also to make it much more potent. It would be the way if you were a terrorist,
Yeah,
you could create a bio weapon, like that. And so I think it is really a cause for concern, and
right,
and regulation is going to, like a lot of regulation, locks only keep out honest people, don't they? And regulation, I think, yeah, at a government level, people aren't going to do this stuff, but I don't worry about those people nearly as much as I do about the rogues
right.
or terrorists, really, or
Absolutely.
yeah. So anyway, I don't want to scare people too much, but I think that is one thing people ought to be a little scared about, and I Um,
That's like what 30% of podcasts are for scaring people with scary hypothetical scenarios which may or may not happen. But
yeah.
let's go to another thing that we haven't touched on that I think is really impactful and big, which is genomics. So this idea that through our genetics we can gain a much better idea about how we would individually metabolize a drug or a supplement. I think this is a whole space that could even maybe be one of the most important things that we do genetics tests for. You know, if you take one example of SSRIs, I just spoke to a Dr. Joanna Moncrief and learned a lot about the side effect profile of SSRIs and the kind of people that they work in, the kind of people that they don't seem to work in. If it were possible to do a genetics test to predict how your individual metabolism could break down an SSRI and what kind of side effects, if you have the metabolic profile that is better suited to a particular type of SSRI, I think this could have enormous potential. You know, to say of the suite of drugs, which one is best matched to your genetics, or you know which of the side effects are going to be better for you. Like I think this whole space has huge potential, but I haven't seen as many people talking about this.
Oh, yeah. It's actually a very big area of research. It's probably one of the first.
Yeah.
And when I said that medicine is moving from cure to prevention, and they need prediction for that, the other P is personalized. So there's
Yes.
a huge area of trying to personalize research instead of one size fits all, like with drugs. You know, the idea is, as you're saying, if you can get a drug that works specifically well for people who of a particular genotype, that so that is a huge area of research, and I agree with you. It's very important, and drugs are very amenable to this because you know it's a very specific environmental agent, you know, and we know
Yes.
any drug works very differently, and it isn't just your body weight or you know whether you're a male or female. You can get
Right.
down to genes, and so that's such a hugely important area of research. There
Huge.
is really quite a lot of research on that. Drug responses, even not just drug responses, but in psychology, a very big effort is looking at psychological treatments like for depression. And CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, works for some people quite well, but not for others.
Right.
Some drugs work for people who are depressed and not others. But what if you could, and there's like half a dozen big studies looking at this, what if you could decide ahead of time which people are likely, genetically, on the basis of their polygenic scores, likely to respond to CBT
Exactly.
rather than drugs? And with drugs, you know, the bad thing about depression drugs like the SSRIs, it's really just trial or error. And it's not like one shot. You got to go for weeks with one drug. And if it doesn't work, then you go to another drug for weeks to try it out. And in the meantime, you might have committed suicide. So these are really big issues. And, you know, so it isn't just pharmacogenetics, it's also
Yes,
on psychological treatments that we want to look for personalized treatments. And I think genetics will give us a good handle on that.
for sure. I think Keon said that they're introducing that onto the platform soon, which I think could be huge because I think you're right that, say, monogenic carrier genes for people that are looking to have children might be the number one use case for them. But if I'm a 25 to 30-year-old who just wants to get my genetic profile, maybe not looking at kids right away, I
Mhm.
think possibly the single greatest use case for them in terms of how they can get the test and then change their life based on it is breakdowns on what kinds of drugs that they are best for. And like, even this is going to be maybe controversial to say, but recreational drugs, like people are going to do recreational drugs, and like the side effects that people suffer is massive. You
Mhm.
know, like if I had a very good idea of alcohol dependence, you know, how I should drink alcohol or what types I should drink alcohol, if I had a good idea of, you know, if I do MDMA, will I suffer a serotonin syndrome for a week? You know, like there's so many of these things, and like people are going to do recreational drugs. Like maybe the like I can match the right amount of THC to my cannabis. You know, there's
That's
there's
right.
there's so many questions which are so
Yeah.
important. Like, am I prone to psychosis through cannabis or psychedelics, or am I more likely to, like, LSD is going to work better? Or, you know, these are insights that I think people would be really helpful, and I've never really heard anyone talk about, but it's the most actionable, really, like in terms of what people are doing on a daily basis right now.
Yeah. Well, I agree completely with you. And the general point being that we can personalize all sorts of treatments and experiences. There are websites where people talk, where they will provide, say, nutritional information based on your genotype, recommendations for sports that you should or should not play, because a lot of it is actual dangers. Rather, we think about them as positives, but running, for example, is not a good idea for some people, and
Right.
depending on bone type. So that's a huge area of research, and I think it's going to be a long time before you get much funding, though, for your plans to figure out what recreational drugs will work best for you.
But in terms of harm
I
reduction,
know, I know, but
how beneficial would that be, right?
right, but sell that to a granting agency.
I think that exposes a huge issue we have with the granting agencies. Like I've been speaking to David Nutt recently, who I'm a
Yeah,
huge fan of, and he talks very practically about, like people do drugs. It's like it's not news, but like if you really care, if your policy is genuinely intended towards harm reduction, then you would be doing a lot more research on cocaine, on MDMA, on alcohol,
yeah,
especially coming from Ireland and being from growing up in Dublin City, where like, drug problems are a very big issue. We're liable to our stupidity and wealth in that scenario. Like the cocaine is a huge issue. Like how you could do a massive amount of harm reduction by studying these things in more depth.
yeah,
Like I remember in college, like you would see half of the people do MDMA and be completely fine, and half of the people would be depressed for a week. And we just accept that as a thing that's true, but no one seems to want to do research on why that is. Like that seems incredibly important to me, that we understand why there's such a difference there, and an important difference.
yeah. Well, I agree with you, and I think we should research everything. But I do think the pushback you get on that is the flip side. You'd be telling people it's okay if you do cocaine or heroin.
They're going to do it anyway, right? Like,
I know.
yeah, I know you're,
Don't
yeah,
mean, but I just think if you were a PhD student thinking about research priorities, I would have to encourage you to think elsewhere. I mean, David Nutt had so much trouble getting funded and
so
everything,
much trouble.
and he was on the side of the angels as far as I was concerned. I mean,
Yeah,
he still
yeah,
is.
exactly. Again, in turn, like if you're genuinely doing science to improve people's lives, like probably recreational drugs is one of the most important things that we should be studying a lot, and SSRIs and side effects as well, because a huge amount of the UK and Ireland are on SSRIs. Probably somewhere between 15 and 20%, and we just do not know what they're doing. Is there a really good use case or example where we've already linked someone's genetic results to their metabolism of a drug or outcomes in drugs? Is there a good example of that already?
I think just at the single gene level, though, and
Okay.
so, and that definitely is happening. But yeah, at the polygenic score level, I don't know that there are good examples of that. It's still kind of gross stuff about CBT versus drugs, because for depression, the jury's out as to whether long-term CBT isn't better than drugs, and
Yeah.
if that works, that'd be great. I mean, I think we should all do CBT prophylactically. It's just
Right.
a wise way of living. Don't ruminate on the bad stuff. I mean, you can think of it as your grandmother's advice, sort of, at some level. But
Yes.
I think it can be very useful, and it's really a way of preventing disorders, rather than. So anyway, these are all getting quite far away from my expertise, but it's interesting talking to you about these issues.
Yeah, like that's what it's. I don't like to keep these things too bounded. I think these are all super interesting rabbit holes and make for an interesting conversation. It's interesting that you bring up CBT. I've for the last couple of weeks joined an aphantasia company. Have you heard of aphantasia?
No.
So aphantasia is the inability to visualize images in your mind's eye.
Ah,
So
yes, I have heard about that. Yeah.
yes, and it seems like the prevalence is a lot higher than people expected. So probably between 2 and 5% of people can have absolutely no imagery in their mind's eye. And that extends to multimodal imagery. So they can't imagine taste, they can't imagine smell, they can't imagine touch. They have limited emotional autobiographical content to their memories. There's huge implications for it, and I don't think any real genetics work has been done on this. That's one point.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm working on with this company is trying to adapt CBT principles to people with aphantasia. So a large part of CBT is positive visualization and visualization exercises.
Mm.
And for people who can't visualize, this is a very frustrating and non-productive type of exercise because
Interesting.
they just report that they go along with the therapist because they don't understand what the hell they're talking about, because they don't know when you say imagine to them or picture things, they don't even know what you mean.
Hmm.
I am So again, just to maybe finish off the rabbit hole, that's I think that's a really interesting aspect as well. But I agree with you that CBT is very important, but we need more awareness of people that can actually visualize and can actually do CBT fully, and we need to adapt those practices to them.
Right. Personalization.
Right. And another point there is the neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that we will reduce neurodivergence through IVF embryo selection, even not editing? If we have I think we can agree, or most people can agree, although it's a difficult statement to say, that the Down syndrome embryo is probably not getting chosen. But is the autistic embryo going to get chosen? This one's really controversial because I think it's a terrible idea to erase autism as a neurodivergence, or try to reduce prevalence of autistic traits. But will that naturally occur?
Well, at a practical level, the polygenic score for autism is one of the weakest predictors we have,
Okay,
even
that's
though
interesting.
autism is highly heritable. So it's a real puzzle as to what's going on there. But there's a lot of other issues, as I talk about in Blueprint. I'm really kind of against the idea of disorders.
Yes, I know.
And so I think, but the same argument would be true if you think about it as a continuum, which I believe it is. There's autistic-like symptoms. They don't hang together in a syndrome, and it isn't us normal people versus those autistic people. It's very much a
Yes,
continuum. And to the
yes,
extent there are genes involved, we all have thousands of these genetic factors associated with autism. It's a quantitative issue rather than qualitative. It's more or less rather than either or. So
yes,
with all that as a preface, I think your point is still a good one. Will we reduce the variability? And I don't think so, because autism is related to a lot of positive things. Much of the
right.
research now is about the strengths of autism, the issues of Silicon Valley, and, it maybe we're already selecting for autism in the sense that, it's like a mating environment there, isn't it? And so there are people who think that we're actually increasing the rate of autism. But a point you made earlier is important about schizophrenia. It wasn't just a joke when Kian was saying that he'd select a child with high schizophrenia, because there's 3 big studies now that show that um, if you have a high score on schizophrenia, and we're talking about, like, mine's pretty high, 85th percentile
Wow.
for schizophrenia, but only 1% of the population has been diagnosed as schizophrenia. So it's a
Yeah,
long way from being schizophrenic. But these 3 studies show that people with higher polygenic scores for schizophrenia are in more creative jobs, which
yeah,
kind of makes sense. I mean, maybe it does involve, you could call it being out of touch with reality, but it could also be just thinking outside the box. And
yes,
it may be that if you go too far outside the box, you lose touch with reality. That's possible. But it's true of a lot of these so-called disorders that it may be that there are good aspects to it as
yeah,
well. We haven't studied, and we especially haven't studied the low end. You think of like ADHD is the most commonly diagnosed childhood disorder, and we think about, oh, it's bad. But if there had been the label ADHD when I was in school, which there wasn't, I would have definitely been diagnosed as ADHD. I was highly
yeah,
active, had a short attention span, because what they were teaching me was boring. And it's true of ADHD kids. You get them into computers or something that they love, there's
yeah,
nothing wrong with their attention span. It's just
exactly.
they're easily bored. So, okay, that's the problematic end, supposedly. But what's the other end? Because polygenic scores are normally distributed, but no one studies the other end because they think of it as a disorder. So you either
Yes,
have ADHD or not, which is so wrong, in so
yes,
many ways. But this opens up the other end of it. And I think the other end of most of these dimensions are problematic. Like, what's the low end of, say, ADHD has low attention span? What's the low end? It could be compulsiveness.
right.
If ADHD kids are considered impulsive, it may be compulsive. Or BMI, what's at the low end? It doesn't mean just a low risk for obesity. I think the low end.
Anorexia or
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, you're easily disgusted by food. I think that's something that's, the case with anorexics. So
Yeah.
there's a huge area of research here that has just barely been touched, and that's the other end of these normal distributions of polygenic
Yes.
risk. So you can see why I'm excited about it, and I'm never going to be able to retire because all this stuff has come up since I reached retirement age. I never
Yeah.
thought we'd have the genome sequence or any of these things like SNP chips or whole genome sequencing or polygenic scores. So it really is a very exciting time to be in
Yeah.
research. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of questions that haven't even been touched yet.
Yes. I love everything that you just said there. I think the number one takeaway for me from our first podcast and what I got from your book was that quantitative versus qualitative. I think that's really, and I don't think it would be radical to say, has completely shifted my mental model of how I think about these labels and categories.
Mm.
And I've probably parroted that back to almost every guest I've had on, because I just think it's such an important point.
And would you say, though, is this my bias about neuroscience in general, that it's nomothetic, it's dealing with how the human species processes information, for example, whereas our research is all about individual differences,
Right.
and there's no necessary connection between the two. So the 99.9% of our 3 billion base pairs of DNA is what makes us human. It's the same for all of us. And that's a lot of the way the brain's wired and the brain processes information. But it's that 0.1% that makes us different. And that's what I'm interested in studying, because when you talk about disorders, you're talking about differences. So I think neuroscience has a long way to go in terms of getting into individual differences and to realize that if there's thousands of DNA variants that affect these behavioral disorders and you know um, is there any chance that there's going to be any simple pathways in the brain? I think
Right.
not. And
No.
so I do think there's a lot of work in neurogenetics that can be done, and I think will be very exciting.
Right. I completely agree. I just spoke to Dr. Nicole Rust, who basically wrote a book about why the hell we haven't cured any major neurodegenerative disorders in the last 4 decades.
Right.
That we've spent over 20 billion on Alzheimer's research, depression research, Parkinson's research, but we're really no closer to a cure. And it's because the general approach has been treating the brain as this linear chain of dominoes
Exactly
where you
right.
have genes create circuits, create brain, and you're just kind of looking for the single fault in the completely linear chain. But I mean, anyone that's even remotely studied the brain for 10 minutes knows that it's not a linear system. Like,
Exactly
it's a
right.
ridiculous idea. It's the most nonlinear system possibly in the universe that's ever been created.
Exactly right.
And she was talking in her book about how we need to have much more complex mathematical models that looks at very large system dynamics, and we can't just zoom in and treat the brain as linear and hope that that gets us a cure for Alzheimer's disease. We need to give it the complexity that it deserves, and that's the only chance we have to make progress.
I really couldn't agree more.
I think we've suffered a lot from our lack of technology, really. She explains it as well that 20 years ago she was able to record from one neuron. Yeah, like it's kind of hard to treat the brain as an incredibly complex system with 86 billion neurons if you can only record one of them at a time.
Yeah.
You can kind of understand that a little bit, but now we can record populations of millions of neurons, and we
Mm.
can use mathematical models which are predictive for different circuit dynamics, and
Yeah.
whole very interesting space of what AI will do with really creating models of systems that we just couldn't before. So I think we were limited by technology, and I'm hoping the next decade there will be a lot of neuroscience advances. I hope, because technology is now starting to be able to model and give the complexity that the brain deserves.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Well, here's to it.
yeah, super interesting topics. How will you think AI will impact genetics? Like, have you thought a lot about this?
Yeah, well, I have a PhD student now whose job it is to try to incorporate AI as much as possible in improve with the simple criterion of improving polygenic score prediction. there's a lot of AI work being done, but
Interesting.
um, I, and right now it's more like machine learning, but that's a step on the way. But I do think AI, I mean, everyone says it, that AI is going to change everything. And how can it not change our understanding of the complexity of 3 billion base pairs of DNA and how that gets translated through the brain and into behavior? So there's no doubt in my mind that's going to make a big difference. But right now, there isn't any example I can point to where it has. But certainly the Nobel Prize was given for AlphaFold,
Right.
and that was amazing, really, to do that. That was machine learning more than anything, though, wasn't it? Just here's the DNA sequence. Tell me how the protein looks, how it folds.
Yeah.
So, but that was brilliant in itself as a demonstration of the power of machine learning, you know, in this contest to predict a DNA sequence and how it leads to folding of a protein. And you get all these biochemists with all their theories of how this stuff works. And it wiped the floor first time around just
Yeah.
by training it on thousands, millions of DNA sequences and how they fold, you know?
Yes. The
So
hard work of PhD students who spent 4 years trying to recreate one singular
exactly
protein.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's amazing, and it's definitely worthwhile all of us keeping our eye on it because, you know, it's got to make a huge difference. I mean,
Where do you think, what are you most hopeful for AlphaFold? Where do you think, is it the drug discovery side? Is it the environmental side? Kind of, those are sort of the two ones that you get here thrown out. What are your thoughts on AlphaFold and where you think it will have
yeah.
huge impacts?
Well, I'm not at all an expert on that, and I study DNA differences, and I don't even do transcription, expression, or even you know um, proteins. And they're so much more complicated than. But I like DNA because it's so simple; it doesn't change. You know,
Yeah.
and eventually we're going to. I think in part through AI, begin to understand the pathways between genes, brain, and behavior. But we're so far away from that, even for single gene disorders. 1937, we found out that phenylketonuria is a single gene recessive disorder, and it really is a single gene, and we know what it does wrong and why it causes brain damage early in life if you don't give people a diet low in phenylalanine. We knew that, but we still really don't know anything about the pathways between
Right.
DNA, transcription, the proteins. And it's not a protein, it's protein complexes that are important. So it really is very complicated, but eventually we're going to get there where we know the pathways between genes, brain, and behavior. I hope even for highly polygenic traits.
Yeah. I'm so excited about how we will continue to demystify this idea of how genes even impact behavior in the first place. Like there's a kind of a huge question mark of, genes code for proteins, proteins are molecular machines, but then you get like, how do molecular machines impact extroversion, risk taking? Like there's a chasm wide of how we just don't really understand how you get from molecular machines to all of these different traits, which, as you point out again and again correctly, are so predicted by these little letters of DNA. It's preposterously weird.
I agree, especially when you're thinking there's tens of thousands of them that affect extroversion.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots to discover yet, for sure. But again, I would just say I'm blown away by the advances we've made so far, and we can point to how far we have to go. But I do believe in celebrating the advances we've made because a lot of people don't realize how big they are.
Right. No, I agree, and I think it's one of the best things I get to do on this podcast. And I'm very optimistic, even though I like to go into the murky waters to try and tease them apart and see what's in there. I am generally optimistic. What do you mentioned polygenic scores quite a lot. What do you really think is the ultimate societal value from really good polygenic scores? Like, what do you think is the best use case for society?
Yeah. Well, so much of the research, and like in neuroscience as well, in molecular genetics, is on causal sorts of models. And that's like the gripe people have. Polygenic scores, if there's tens of thousands of genes involved, how are you going to do anything causal with that? But I have a paper called Prediction, Not Explanation. And the value, I think, of polygenic scores is prediction. And that's not nothing. And, scientists are so reductionistic, if you can't, and neuroscientists especially, if you can't explain it at lower levels of
You're
explanation.
better than this than me. I like to explain. I like to understand. You're very good at just saying practically, look, this is how it is, but I can't explain the rest.
And this is what we can do. But, prediction is so important. I do think, well, if you, it's why medicine is totally moving from the idea of curing to preventing and predicting disorders. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as Benjamin Franklin said. And so it is important, but it's sort of practical, and it doesn't sound very exciting to scientists. But I'm all for sort of practical applications of this work, and that's
For
why
sure.
what we never got into your scores though in all this discussion, have we?
Not fully. I went through some of the different traits, so like height. So we can go through a few for sure. On the traits, as I said, I was 11 centimeters off my actual height, which I thought was interesting. Also interesting here, it says that there's 416,000. I know you were kind of explaining these numbers, genes that contribute to height. This one was very surprising to me. I don't know why I had like, there's probably 10 genes that that dictate height. I was very shocked that was such a large amount of genes
No.
contribute to your height.
But as I tried to explain before, that's almost an artifact of the way we create polygenic scores. Of
Right.
those 400,000, I'd say 300,000 have nothing to do with height. That is,
Okay.
they're essentially zero estimates. But I was concerned, the first step, if you were now thinking of PGT, getting married, having children, are you a carrier for anything important?
Yes, let's go into that. So, I have a very elevated risk of hemochromatosis. So I have two recessive genes for hemochromatosis. So I haven't gone to the doctor yet. I probably should. My dad has always commented about having very high iron levels. So
Wow.
the first light bulb that went off was, okay, if we have a propensity to store and not break down iron, that could be a concern with my dad. Now, I don't think he's suffered. He's the kind of guy that's kind of never suffered a symptom in his life. I don't think he's stepped foot in a hospital unless he's wheeling someone else in. So like,
Huh.
I don't think he's suffered any consequences, but I would check that iron level. But the biggest finding was that I'm a carrier for hemochromatosis and I have a very elevated risk myself.
Right. And do they convert that? Because of this Lasse Fulkerson, the scientific director of Nucleus, I saw their initial sort of products for people, and if you compared it to other companies, they do a better job at explaining risk, because
The explanation's great,
you've
really,
got
really good.
relative risk versus absolute risk. So you could have a high relative risk, but your absolute risk of hemochromatosis could be very low.
Yes,
Do you
they
know?
do a really good job at that. As a communicator, the thing that I'm very critical on is how they communicate information. I thought the platform itself is
That's right.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And throughout this conversation, I'll put screenshots on the screen for how they show the different normal distribution graphs and where I am, and they've really good explanations. I have to say that that's the biggest compliment I would have, is that they are very good at minimizing the chance that you will take something incorrectly from the information, because especially because I did 23andMe years and years ago, like 8 years ago or something now, and I thought they didn't do nearly as good a job at communicating that.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
So the other carrier genes I have three, which apparently is actually above average. I don't know. He kind of said most people sort of have one or two, and maybe three, but maybe slightly above average to have three. The other one is Johansson Blizzard syndrome. I'd never heard of it.
I don't know it.
Yeah, it would be quite a severe nervous system disease that I don't know the specifics, but it would be a very, like, I think an exceedingly rare one that, again, if my future wife had that
Yeah.
one, we would definitely do IVF, because that's a very serious one. You wouldn't want to roll the dice and accidentally get that.
Yeah. Because even if it's very rare, and the chances that your spouse would also have this very rare condition is very, very low.
Yes.
But if you are both carriers,
Yes.
it's a 25% risk. It doesn't matter how rare the disorder is. So
Yes.
that's the real bite with these recessive disorders. So that's a good one. And what's the third one?
Thyroid dishormonogenesis 6. So there's at least 6 variants of this, and I don't really know what that is, but some dysfunction of the thyroid,
Mm-hmm.
probably, it seems like.
What is your risk look like? When you said they got a population distribution and they
I
showed
would have to check. I'll put it on the screen. I would have
okay,
to
good.
check the exact numbers. I just wrote down the carrier genes for here, but I didn't. I'll put all of the normal distribution graphs on the screen for people to
And
see.
what's your highest polygenic score?
I
Risk.
believe it was.
Like, how did
So
you do on it?
hemochromatosis was the highest for sure.
But I meant in terms of psychological sorts of things. Did you get educational achievement, schizophrenia, that sort
So
of thing?
schizophrenia was very low. OCD, I think, was elevated risk, which is interesting because I wouldn't. Again, I like the way you have framing on this, which is like I don't have OCD or not, but I might have some traits that are OCD like, which is interesting because I wouldn't have necessarily said that about myself or
Yeah.
anyone in my family.
But
But
it's a normal distribution, right? So 85% of the people are around that middle. And so it's
yes,
only when you get out to the extremes that it's going to really tell you anything. And the
yes,
problem is most people are in the middle. So when most people get their scores back, they think, well, I'm just kind of middle for everything. But in a way that's cool because as I was saying before, I think Oscar Wilde was right. All things in moderation, that either ends really can be problematic. And so being in the middle is a good thing. It's like
yes, of
not
course.
having any of those mutations, that you talked about. So I do find that's the major disappointment people have is they say, well, nothing very interesting. Like in my case, having this 94th percentile for body mass, for obesity, for body mass index, that was pretty telling. And then the 85th percentile for schizophrenia was interesting. And
Right.
just like Kian was saying, though, I've come around, maybe it's, just sort of sour grapes in a way to say, well, that could actually be a positive. I do kind
Yes.
of value my thinking outside the box and, scientific creativity anyway, even though I'm
Yes.
about zero in terms of artistic creativity.
Like, who's to say that didn't contribute towards all of the research that you've done, which was so important but incredibly controversial for its time?
Yeah.
What genes in your genome, like where a lot of other people would have been more sheepish and not gone down that route, you just decided, right, this is an interesting area. I don't really give a shit what anyone else says.
Yep. Yep. I think personality does enter into a lot of these things. And in genetics, especially when I was in graduate school, you had to be tough. You had to have a thick skin because
Right.
people didn't want to talk about genetics.
Where I lost all confidence in polygenic scores, and this just it made the whole test seem unreliable to me, is it said I had below average muscle. And when I heard that below average muscle, I said, no way, that's not accurate. I've always prided myself in being an athlete my whole life. I have above average muscle, and the whole test threw it out, threw it in the bin. There's no reliable. No, I'm joking, but
Yeah,
I
but
was surprised myself.
how far below the mean were you, though?
It was quite a bit, actually. And again, surprised because I've been an athlete my whole life and would somewhat pride myself in my muscle gaining abilities, although not at the moment.
But you can, of course, I mean, that's a very complex thing, isn't it? And they're only talking about a few, I don't know, are these polygenic scores for what?
So this one was 139 genes only for muscle.
For muscle what, though? Do you know?
Yeah, it just said, I'll get the precise details. I have just below average muscle. I think it identified a certain high impact genes for just gaining muscle in general.
Huh. Because, there's a huge area of research on athletics here,
Yes.
or like with horses, because if you can get 1% improvement in a horse's speed,
Right.
that's millions and millions of dollars, because that's just the margins you're dealing with. And that's also true with elite athletes. So there's a huge area of research on this, in Russia especially,
Yes.
to try and gain that little bit of prediction. And most of the research so far, there's this book written by Epstein, who was a sports writer for Sports Today or Illustrated.
David Epstein. Yeah, I've read
Yeah.
this. Range, is it?
Right, the Sport Gene or something like.
Oh, the Sports Gene as well.
Yeah.
I think he wrote Range as well. Or
Yeah.
both really good books. Yeah.
Sports Gene were a long time ago, and it was kind of single gene oriented. But back then, and even now, there are companies on the web that will give you information as to what is it, the fast muscle genes. There's
Yes,
power
fast.
genes and speed
Yes.
genes, and so they actually don't account for much variance. But that was the information people got, and I don't know that there are huge GWAS studies related to muscle. So I don't know how good that
Yes.
gene is, those genes you're talking about, that polygenic score. I don't know how good it is. So, and especially when it's something as vague as just muscle. I mean,
Yeah. I would have loved, now this is very specific to me, but like a sports section would have been like candy, and like that would have just been candy for me. I would have just gone through every single tiny like nuance of like VO2 max, lactate threshold, like everything. I thought would have been so interesting there, even if the genes aren't that predictive of outcome. It would have just been interesting to me, but
yeah,
it didn't have that much of a breakdown for that.
right.
Maybe it's just
But
more
it could be
research
the
needs to be
data
done.
aren't so good either
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is a big area of research. And if you go on the web, there are certainly genomic companies, direct to consumer companies that focus on athletic ability. But again, they're not very good, and they can give you information that makes you feel like you're really learning a lot. But if the basic GWAS studies aren't there, that the information they give you can't be very useful.
This would be, I really want, this is very strange and personal to me, but I would have been very curious on like like the shape of bodies. So I have never, and I don't mean to say this to boast, I have never met someone in my life who has larger calves than me. I can put them on the screen. I have very, very large calves. They've just always, it's always been a thing where people point it out to me. They'll meet me and then they say, you have horrendously large calves, grotesquely large. I've heard a lot, and I really want to know why that is, because that's like, I joke with people when they ask me like, how did you get such big calves? And I often joke like, oh, 1,000 calf raises every single morning, even though I've done less than 10 calf raises in my entire life. It's like basically 100% genetics. My dad has huge calves. My mom has pretty big calves. Like, this is one that I was just curious, like, where are the calf genes? Because this is one where I played sport my whole life, and that probably meant that I reached my genetic potential. But again, I've never met someone with larger calves than me.
Yeah, are larger calves good for a particular sport?
I'm really good at going uphill. That's
I
about as much as I could say. So in
Probably
triathlon,
jumping. It's not so good for jumping, is it? I mean,
it's not as useful as you'd think, really,
no.
at all. It doesn't make me a particularly good runner. I think uphill is pretty much all it. Like, I think
Uh-huh.
I would pride myself in my uphill hiking. But other than that, I have a hypothesis at the moment that it might help for swimming, because I kind of have two airbags attached to my legs, which reduces
Ah.
drag by pushing my legs up. But that's a complete guess. Other than that, I've gotten ridiculously, like, I can turn traffic lights on by tensing my calf, but that's, it's not that it's really not that useful.
Yeah.
But an interesting one,
Yeah.
I would have loved. I think in the future it would be really cool when you can have these incredibly personalized things and be like, investigate it. Like, I'd love to kind of go digging into the genome and find where the calf size specification genes are.
Hmm.
Utterly random.
I don't think there's ever been a even quantitative genetic study on that. But, as you say, your family's, an N of one, but it's,
Large
it's
calves.
pretty persuasive, because it's at the extreme like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so again, you're pointing out, so many areas of research that need to be done yet.
Yes.
So I think that's very interesting.
Another one that was interesting was, it said I was below average risk taking. Now, this, I don't think, I've been an entrepreneur my whole life, have turned down many stable jobs for, financial insecurity, trying to build companies. And so I would say that I would definitely be on the other side of the spectrum
Yeah.
in terms of taking financial risk,
Yeah.
but I might not be too inclined to climb a 100-meter vertical cliff face.
Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah. But that's one of the weaker risk scores. Personality scores are pretty weak. And
yes,
when you get into an area like that, as you're pointing out, it's so heterogeneous, I mean, does that mean you're risky with sex or with
exactly.
drugs or driving or,
Yes,
sports? You're saying no. And taking risks financially, that's important. But how correlated are all of these? I don't think
yes,
they are that correlated. I mean,
right.
really, if you're well, anyway, so, but the bottom line is the polygenic scores are not strong yet for those
Yes.
personality traits.
It is an interesting question, though. Is taking financial risk and being an entrepreneur related to your tendency to want to climb big cliff faces or skydive, or bungee jump, or any of these other things? I have no idea.
I don't
Is
know
there
either.
localized risk clusters that kind of
So I know there's some research on it, but I know it's heterogeneous. I mean, it's not like just one thing. Are you risky? Yes or no?
yeah.
Obviously.
And this was 166 genes. Like, I was very curious on how it would these probably have been studies that they've isolated and found where that looked at this particular thing, and then they took those genes and that's how they built their polygenic risk
Yeah,
scores
as
for
I say,
these things?
I think it's probably an artifact of the construction of the polygenic scores. So if you publish a GWAS study, you're now supposed to publish summary statistics for all the SNPs. Say if you did a SNP chip 600,000. But a lot of studies only only make available the top SNPs. And 23andMe were particularly bad. They only provided information, say, on the first 1,000 SNPs or
It's
something,
quite limited, yeah.
because there's so much more information in the next few thousand, or even 10,000 or 20,000. So nowadays, you would publish all that information. But my guess is those studies you've been referring to with a much smaller number of SNPs, that's a function of that's all that was available.
Yes.
That was all that was published. So Nucleus Genomics didn't do these genome-wide studies. The neat
Yeah.
thing is it's a very collaborative area, and when people do GWAS studies, they publish the summary statistics that would allow anybody to create a polygenic score from their summary statistics.
Yes. And I think one way that they are updating their models is that if you can go into your traits and basically put in your height and you put in your different characteristics, so then it's somewhat, I think, corrects against that as a learning function. So you can go in and say your actual height is this, and it would say, oh, it undershot by whatever centimeters, and that helps the learning of the models.
Maybe. I'm not too sure about that, but yeah, it's possible. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. One thing we haven't said that we should emphasize, you just alluded to it, and that is ethnic stratification
Mm,
in history. What needs to be done on these websites is to say you have to adjust these polygenic scores for ancestry, because almost all of the work has been done on Northern European white
yes.
Caucasian samples, not
Yes.
because of bias. It's just those are the samples that governments paid money to have these studies done. There's a huge effort now in China and Southeast Asia and other ethnic groups. But for now, it's important for people who don't have in England on the census data, you'd say white British or whatever, you know, eh, people with the farther away you get ancestrally from that, the less good the predictions are.
Right.
So that's another thing that it's a very big deal in research now. And in the US and the UK, there are intentions to try to get better representation of other ancestral groups. But
Yes.
until that happens, if you're not white British or white Northern European, you should keep in mind that these scores are much less predictive.
It's a really good point. Do we know how much different populations change? I know this is where genetic research can get very controversial, the difference
Yeah,
between groups.
I know.
But
Yeah,
do we know how big some of
yeah.
these traits can
On
vary?
average, you could say that the prediction goes down linearly as a function of the DNA difference between groups. So when you do a GWAS study, one of the first things you do is you get clusters of genetically related individuals. And these are genetically unrelated individuals. So you're talking about ancestral clustering. So you get big clusters, Chinese Han, if you had a Chinese sample, you get a dozen different groups. They're quite heterogeneous. And the most heterogeneous groups are in Africa, because
Yes.
we're out of Africa. So the populations there have diverged, and they're much more heterogeneous, actually. So, it's ridiculous to say Africans or even Zimbabweans or
Like it's one thing.
whatever. Yeah. So there's a great deal of heterogeneity. But when you do these GWAS studies on Northern Europeans, if you go down to Chinese or Southeast Asians, maybe the predictions are only half as good.
Right.
And if you go down to an African group, they're even less good.
Yeah.
But now there are studies in Africa, but the problem they run into there is there's so many heterogeneous groups there. There's no such thing as, a Black African sample, for example.
Right.
So it is an important qualification in terms of the predictive power of these polygenic scores. But again, it's a research opportunity, and um, it does remind me to say controversially that when people say ethnicity is a social construct, I'd say, look at the DNA studies. It's just blind DNA for people.
Yeah.
And they identify clusters of related individuals who self-identify as these ethnic groups. It's just overpowering.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. Okay, well, I'm glad you agree. But, it's still quite controversial with some people saying, no, ethnicity is just a social construct.
Well, I think culture swung in a very strange direction when they started saying there's no biological difference between males and females
Yeah.
as another controversial issue, which I just never had any time for. It's like, well,
Yeah.
that's obvious because there's obviously a
And in
difference.
England, which I always thought of as kind of a more advanced culture on that sort of thing, it took the Supreme Court 3 months ago. The Supreme Court had to rule that there are biological differences between men and women. And when
That's
I tell
bonkers,
friends,
isn't it?
that I actually had to watch out. I was always afraid someone was going to ask me about that, because as a geneticist, there's no way I can say males and females are the same. I mean,
Yeah,
you look
yeah.
at their chromosomes and, there's an XX and an XY. And so gender, yeah, sure, I understand that completely. But to say
Yes,
there are no
exactly.
biological differences, it drove me bonkers. But in academia even, it would have been tricky to say that a couple years ago, what you just said.
Crazy. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's kind of weird that it seems like whoever is the president of the United States kind of changes the global culture on these things of what we're allowed to say and what aren't.
true,
Isn't
isn't
it?
it? Yeah.
What about between the sexes? If I was a female, would my polygenic scores be any less predictive?
That's an interesting issue. That childhood disorders, for example, we talked about autism and ADHD, they show the biggest sex differences for
Right.
psychopathology. And so you might think, well, maybe there's different predictions for males and females. There aren't. So what is that about? And it could be first thing people look at is the difference between the X and Y chromosome. Maybe there are genes on the Y chromosome. For a while there was a hypothesis that boys are more aggressive and more prone to violence because of a gene MAO
Yes.
on the X chromosome. But it turns out that's not true. And so the simple hypothesis that there's genes on the X or Y chromosome that make males and females different, that doesn't seem to be a big part of it.
Yes.
It may be part of what's going on with mental disability. It's always greater in boys. Boys are more subject to all sorts of neurological problems. But in terms of ADHD and autism, there's just no evidence from twin studies or from DNA studies that you can't find genes or genetic differences between males and females. There's some neat ways of testing that in quantitative genetics. So it's a real puzzle
Yeah.
what that's about. And I think probably it's that the same genes are operating in males and females, but they have different effects in a female brain and a male brain.
The behavioral phenotypes
Yeah, and
differ.
maybe hormonal differences or whatever. So that's my going hypothesis, but there's not, there's not much research definitive in this area. But I do think it's probably the same genes for boys and girls, but those same genes operate differently in a boy brain and a girl brain.
Right. It's a really good point that you brought up the population studies and how these where these numbers are really come from. Are there any other what's the other research that really needs to be done to improve consumer genetic testing to improve polygenic scores? Like what's really important research that we aren't doing at the moment?
Um, I don't know. There's so much research being done on it that I can't point to any one area. I mean, we need bigger studies, to pick up these polygenic, these tiny effects of genes. I guess the one thing I would say is there's this missing heritability gap that is between how much of the genetic variance we can predict with polygenic scores, even for height and weight, which are pretty good. We're still predicting, we rarely predict more than half of the genetic variance. And that's estimated from twin and adoption studies. So that's called the missing heritability gap. And if I could solve one problem, it would be to try to solve that. You know, you know, if God it came down and said, "What would you like to know?" I'd say, "I'd like to know where's that missing heritability, God damn it." And it could be just in greater, tinier and tinier effects. But some people think our models are all additive, and couldn't it be non-additive? The going hypothesis now that's being tested with whole genome sequencing is its rare variants. These 600,000 or so SNPs on SNP chips, which is about 95% of what we know about genomics now, they're common variants. Yet the vast majority of variants are not common. Common's defined as like in 5% or so of the population. But the vast majority of SNPs, like 90% of them, are way less than 0.1% of the variants. But the reason the SNP chips use the common variants is to give you more information. If you had
Right.
a SNP on your SNP chip that was only like 0.1%, then it would only differentiate 1 out of 1,000 people. So it would be of no use to you unless you had millions and millions of people in your sample. So, so that's why common SNPs are on SNP chips. But that's kind of something people are interested in terms of looking at whole genome sequencing, because there you can deal with rare variants. So that for me is the biggest issue, because I'm interested in prediction.
Right. Another thing I learned from our first podcast, and I really do recommend if anyone hasn't listened to it, we cover a lot of the kind of basics that we're building on here in that first episode. One of the things that we talk about is the importance in the non-shared environment. And this was really interesting to me and a bit mysterious. Can you just kind of explain what non-shared environment is, and then we'll dive into its importance, because this was kind of a head scratcher for me as well.
So I'm really glad you raised this topic of non-shared environment, because I do think, as exciting as the advances in genomics are, right now, I think genetic research has told us more about the environment than it has about genetics. And the
Right.
two big examples in my book, chapters in my book, are the nature of nurture was the issue that these environmental measures that we use in psychology show substantial genetic influence. And, I talked about that last time. I think that's such an important topic because,
Yes.
it's what we call in genetics gene environment correlation. And it's the way genes affect behavior, that we use the environment to foster our genetic propensity. So that's one very big issue. But the other one is this more mysterious thing that you're talking about, and that's non-shared environment. So genetics provides the best evidence we have for the importance of the environment. If on average psychological traits are 50% heritable, that means they're 50% not heritable. And we used to call that the environment. And from Freud onwards, it was always thought that that was nurture, in the sense of systematic effects of family environment, mostly parenting is what most of the research was about. So schizophrenia was thought to be due to what your mother did to you in the first few years of life.
Right.
And
Which is quite unfair on mothers.
yeah, and a lot of it was mother blaming. So I
Yeah.
often say, if you think genetics is dangerous, try environmentalism, because
Yeah.
so the non-shared environment is the idea, is the notion that um, children growing up in the same family you think would have the same environment. But it turns out what makes them similar is not nurture, it's nature, it's DNA. DNA differences account for what makes siblings similar. So what runs in families isn't parenting or nurture, it's DNA. The environment's important, but it's not making them similar. So what on earth is it that's making two kids growing up in the same family, same schools, all of that, so different? And that's why I wrote a book with my wife, Judy Dunn, called Why Are Siblings So Different? And that was 30 years ago. We started that book was in 1990, but there was research in the previous decade pointing to the importance of non-shared environment. That is, it's not shared by two kids in a family. And that could be differential parenting. It could be that parents treat one kid differently from the other, but it turns out that's not a big deal. Judith Harris wrote a famous book called The Nurture Assumption that said maybe it's peers. We always study the family, but siblings are different age, so they have different peers. So maybe the peers have a different effect. Turns out that's not it either. And after 30 years of research on hundreds of studies trying to identify what these non-shared environmental influences are, pretty much come up empty-handed.
Weird.
And yet it's 50% of the variance. Now, that includes unreliability of measurements, so you have to discount that. But whatever is environmental isn't shared by two kids growing up in the same family. For personality and psychopathology, the exception is school achievement and cognitive ability, but most of those studies were done in childhood. And now that we have studies later in life, in adulthood, it turns out that this shared environmental influences for cognitive development diminishes during adolescence and disappears by adulthood. So there's long stories there, but this latter thing was a meta-analysis we did. We published it a few months ago on cognition as the exception to the rule of non-shared environment. But it turns out that's not even an exception in the long run. Once children
Interesting.
leave the family, it becomes non-shared environment, which means, they get their own experience. So what is it? And I've written a paper called Non-Shared Environment, Real but Random. I think after all this time, if we can't identify these influences, we have to face the possibility that the environment isn't systematic, that it's idiosyncratic, stochastic. And there's a huge wave of research throughout science from um, um, the very basic sort of physics out to cosmology, talking about randomness. And there's several wonderful books, written about it in sports, economics. There's 2 books. We think everything's determined and that if we know enough, we'll be able to predict everything. But I think we have to face the possibility that a lot of what makes us who we are is not of that nature. It's sort of idiosyncratic. And that could be, accidents or illnesses, big effects like that. But the research on this suggests maybe it's stochastic, it's sort of noise in biological systems.
Right.
So you could turn it around and say, isn't it amazing? We can start life with one set of DNA in one cell and become trillions of cells with the same DNA. And despite all the complexities of the biological systems, the environment's life course, they still have an effect later in life. But it's certainly not 100%, but you could say, isn't it amazing it's 1%? I mean, how can they have such effects over such a long span? But turning that around, you could say maybe noise is just reflecting the complexity of biological systems. And what I'm particularly keen on is something people haven't talked about, and that's the complexity of psychological systems. You think of neuroscience and one thing I'm particularly keen on is this book by Anil Seth called Being You. It's called,
Love it. Yeah, I got to speak to Anil on the podcast.
you
Yeah.
have. Oh,
Yes.
he's fantastic, isn't
He's
he?
amazing.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan. Huge fan.
And I do think the Bayesian prediction idea is part of that. And he just
Yes.
has submitted a paper to Behavioral and Brain Science, a target article. That's the one where they elicit commentators. And so he had 250 people submit
I
commentaries.
saw that. I was
Target.
emailing him recently about it, actually. He said he was
Yeah.
just completely swamped by it.
Yeah. And so that's the idea of consciousness in uh, artificial systems, artificial intelligence, and can it be conscious at all? But I really like this idea of Bayesian prediction,
Yes.
because that is sort of stochastic. And there's a new article I just read about the idea. It's called what is it called exactly? But the basic idea is is noise a bug or a feature? And he thinks in terms of predictive processing and a lot of neuroscience, it's actually a feature
Philip Ball said the same.
Did
Philip
he?
Ball, he said that the noise in genetics seems to be a feature, not a bug. He said the
Uh-huh.
exact same, which is weird.
Hmm. Well, I don't know about that in terms of genetics because that's evolution, and I think you could say that there's adaptive value of having genetic variation because that's money in the bank against changing environments
Yeah.
evolutionarily. But I do think at a more immediate level of psychology, I do think the idea of noise in psychological systems like perceptual, Bayesian predictive processing is an
Yes.
interesting example of that. So I do
I have a
think
lot.
I'm really keen. One thing I'm trying to write something about this now. I'm really keen on the idea of stochasticity, which is more than unpredictability. It's like even
Yes.
if contrary Robert Sapolsky and Determined, his book, I think if you knew everything, every atom, everything, and you replayed it, you wouldn't get the same result.
Yes.
So
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm the same.
do you? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really believe. I love Sapolsky's books, but I don't believe his argument in the determinism and no free will.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the problem I have is that how do you study that empirically? And the Bayesian prediction modeling, that's sort of an example of how you can get at it. But I think I'm very much an empiricist, and I like to do things that you can test empirically. But I have come to think, if nothing else, it's very important for people to get the message that shit happens. Life is more a matter of chance than choice to a much greater degree than people think. And
Yes.
when you get into the consciousness stuff of Anil Seth and you get into mindfulness and that sort of thing, you realize that that's a big part of Zen Buddhism, isn't it? The
Yes.
impermanence of things that appear, disappear. And I do think there's some value in us recognizing the great deal of impermanence and chance involved in life. And maybe clinicians should be thinking about making people resilient to that, recognizing that shit does happen, and
Yes.
you need to realize that and to be able to deal with it, which is again where I think CBT might come in as a good prophylactic.
Yes.
But I am getting stuck at thinking that there isn't much you can do empirically with the idea of noise. But
I, I love a lot of what you just said there. I have so many points on it. You mentioned one. I have just these amazing examples of what you said, where twins separated at birth, decades later, and they show these remarkable similarities. I'm sure you've heard of these cases, but have you heard of the Jim twins? This is
oh,
the
of
most
course, yeah,
one of the most absurd things I've ever heard. So I'll just read it out. Perhaps the most famous separated at birth twins ever studied. So raised in different families, they reunited at the age of 39. They were both married and divorced a woman named Linda. Then they both remarried a woman named Betty. They both had sons named James Allen. Both drove the same car. They vacationed at the same Florida beach. They both suffered tension headaches at the same time. They both had dogs named Toy. They both smoked the same brand of cigarettes. And they both worked in security.
yeah,
So but some of those have to be chance.
yeah.
But like I was just like I was blown away reading that. Like,
I know.
what's
But
up with the names?
that
Is there
actually
anything?
that
Are the
data
names complete chance, or
yeah,
is there
I
something
think
to the
so.
names?
Maybe being in security. I mean, they're both, buff sort of guys. Okay,
Yeah,
so that maybe makes a little bit of sense. Many other, like there's that famous film, Three Identical Strangers. Do you
I
know?
have. That's the next
Yeah.
example I have on the
They
page.
were all wrestlers. They grew up not knowing each
Yes,
other. And in America, it's not, they do offer wrestling at school, but you can see why they became wrestlers. They definitely have the squat bodies, for that.
yes,
But the other things, I think it did a disservice in a way, Tom Bouchard's study like that, because it's anecdotes, isn't it?
yes,
And if
and
you and those twins went along with about 50 other sets of twins reared apart in the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. And they went in for a week and they collected something like over 50,000 pieces of information. And if you and I went in as separated identical twins, I bet we would find some amazing coincidences.
Yes.
Our first girlfriends had the same name. We used the same toothpaste, or,
It,
so
it's a funny anecdote for sure.
Yeah.
Although I actually thought, and this is something that I learned from you in the last podcast, is I actually think there's something interesting in the cigarette smoking.
Yeah.
In that you're doing quite a lot of signaling with the type of cigarettes that you smoke that's related to your personality in a lot of core ways. So I think there's an interesting point there where there was multiple of these where they smoked the same cigarette. Because again, you're kind of signaling a lot about your personality with a choice like that.
Could be. But the plural anecdote is not data, right?
Yes, for sure.
But it's important to keep that in mind. And it was too cutesy, some of it, like,
For sure. Again, funny story more than anything, but I just couldn't believe that they both divorced and married the same woman in terms of name. But going back to non-shared environment, I just wanted to add that point because I thought it was a funny sort of story that I'd never heard of before. I'm thinking about the things that I did growing up that had an outsized impact on my personality. And it was definitely the sport that I played by myself. So that was the non-shared environment in my development was definitely playing tennis, playing rugby, playing golf. I didn't play them, generally speaking, with my family or anyone that I had genetic relatedness with. And I think they probably had the most impact on my development overall.
Although how much of that was genetic, though, right? I mean, maybe if you had a separated identical twin, maybe he would also have played those sorts of sports like that. You're saying basically individual sports rather than team sports, right?
Well, no, I more so mean that's my, or at least my interpretation of what my non-shared environment would have been. So like, it wasn't the family dinners at home or the particular disciplining of my parents, any of those particular things, but unless I have the concept wrong, like that's my idea of what non-shared environment is generally the sport that I went out to go play by myself that wasn't shared with any.
Right.
Like it was shared with teammates, but
right.
Is that the right way of thinking about non-shared environment?
Not quite. I think the touchstone for non-shared environment is what makes identical twins growing up in the same family different.
Yes.
Because they are different. And I would think the sports you like the sports I like, I never liked team sports. I always played individual sports. And if you had an identical twin and the identical twin didn't play sports at all, that would be an example of non-shared environment because you're genetically identical. So there's no way to explain differences between you other than to say that it's due to this mysterious non-shared environment. I mean, you can see it's not genetic, right? But your example by yourself, it could be totally genetic.
Could be totally genetic.
Yeah. So it's what makes kids in a family different. But the problem is kids in a family are 50% related genetically. So the only killer test here is identical twins. What makes them different? And that's what a lot of the research has been about. What makes identical twins growing up in the same family different? So, I do think this non-shared environment is mysterious, as you say, but it's such an important topic. And it's very important for parents to realize that not only do they not have control over genetics, which is the major systematic force making us who we are, making our children who they are, they don't really have much control over the environment because if the salient environmental influences are essentially chance, idiosyncratic, stochastic, then parents don't have much control over that either.
So for normal siblings, I completely understand what you're saying, that with the twin studies is really the killer test in terms of this. But non-shared environment between siblings and explaining differences, would that also include activities that they did separately, like the extracurricular things? And you can place some emphasis on, like, what's the non-shared environment between siblings? Is it reasonable to talk about that in that context?
Well, yeah, anything environmental could be studied as a source of non-shared environment. But you have to keep in mind, though, that siblings are different genetically as well.
Yeah.
So you can't exclude the possibility of genetics. So in my paper, one of my most highly cited papers in 1987 on this topic, why are siblings in the same family so different? We said the first thing you got to do is show that there's something in the environment, differences in the environment or experience that relate to differences in outcome. And And to do that, you've got to study differences in the environment for siblings. The huge amount of research on the environment assume that kids in the same family have the same environment. They study parents. Are these parents authoritarian or not? But to study differences, you'd have to say, are the parents more authoritarian to one kid rather than another? Because if they
Right.
don't differ, then it can't be a cause of non-shared environment, because it's the same for both kids. But you can do that. So you can study environments that differ for two kids in a family, even like divorce. Divorce either happens or doesn't happen, but really the effects of divorce can be very different on kids. So if you study the effect of divorce on siblings, that could be a non-shared environmental factor. But then you got to say, do they make a difference in the kid's behavior? So that's step 2. Do these differences in the environment make a difference in siblings' behavior or outcomes? But then you got to say, but they're 50% different genetically. And the third step then is to say, if you control for genetics, there are various ways you can do it. The simplest is to study identical twins. Do these differences make a difference in identical twins outcomes? And
Yes.
what you generally find is everything fails at the third step. You can find differences in experience, like you're saying, one sibling does sports and the other doesn't, or, hangs out with friends who do, but then when you say, but now you control for genetics, it disappears.
Yes. I understand methodologically. I think I was thinking maybe I had the wrong model for that in my head, because what I was thinking about was, why would a non-shared environment have an outsized impact on personality? And I was thinking about what it means to gain an identity and to develop an identity and have a self.
Mhm.
And I was thinking that a core sort of aspect about that is doing stuff by yourself, or kind of not being around your parents where you're under their guidance.
Yep.
And I was thinking about that, what started to develop, because I definitely had a genetic predisposition to like sport, but then that interaction between the environment and my genes created that sort of self-belief in me and that identity that I was a sportsman, and I kept doing it and I kept doing it and I kept doing it, and that had a very big impact on my personality.
Right.
And it did so because it wasn't shared with my family, where they were kind of telling me what to do necessarily. And I'm curious on your thoughts on this. Would that be somewhat of the reason why non-shared environment seems to have so much more impact than shared environment, is that you're simply doing it by yourself. You're kind of not doing it under the provision of your parents. You're going out there in the world and you're exploring and you're gaining a self-identity. And the very fact that it's non-shared means you're kind of out there by yourself against the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of feedback loop would be more independent and self-driven than with your family. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. It's a hypothesis, but there are hundreds of hypotheses about what
Right.
non-shared environment is. When they get tested, they don't seem to work out as
Right. Okay.
systematic sources of non-shared environment, which is why I've come around to the idea of noise and stochasticity. And as I say, it's a very big topic throughout all the life sciences now, the role of randomness or chance. But Evan, I'm going to have to call it quits. I have another.
100%. We've been going for so long. This is so much fun, Robert. Every time I talk to you,
it's great talking to you.
So enjoyable every time, Robert. Thank you so much for your work. Are you writing a book or anything at the moment, or any new papers that are coming up soon?
I'm trying to write. I'm trying not to write books. I think people don't read books now very much, and
it's a shame.
And you get a lot more impact on writing big papers, conceptual sort of papers. So I'm trying to do more of that. And in fact, the one I'm working on now is the stochasticity one. And I'm not sure where it's going, but I'm kind of at that point where I like just picking a hard topic and just seeing where it goes. And usually it ends up going somewhere. So we'll see.
Best of luck with that, Robert. I learned so much in these conversations, and I appreciate your communication and work so much.
Great.
Thank you so much for the time. I get so giddy and I enjoy talking to you so much. I think our conversations are so fun.
Well, you're really a great interview, and
thank you, Robert.
I don't even have to wish you luck in your podcast, because it's really, you're onto a good thing for sure.
That means a lot. Thank you so much.
All right, sure.
I hope you enjoyed that podcast episode with Dr. Robert Plomin. He's an absolute legend, and I learn so much every time I speak with him. Again, Nucleus Genomics are offering my audience 10% off if you want to get your own genetics test results. I really cannot recommend them more as a company and service. I really believe in what they're doing. So check out them in the description below. 10% off using the code EVAN10. Thank you so much, and please let me know how you get on in the comments.